Well, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 25th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone in the room to switch off any mobile devices, as they do affect the broadcasting system, but some members of the committee may be referring to their iPads because their papers will be on those, because we provide them in digital format. Agenda item 1 is a decision to take business in private. Can I seek the agreement of the committee to take item 4 in private, to allow the committee to consider evidence heard today and in the past, and to take all future consideration of evidence heard and draft reports on the Procurement Reform Bill in private? Is that agreed? Agreed. That is agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is taking evidence on the Procurement Reform Bill. We're going to hear evidence from 2 panels of stakeholders on the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill today. The first panel we're going to hear from are from third sector representatives, as well as the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So this morning I welcome Tom Ballantyne, Chair of Stop Climate Chaos, John Downey, Head of Public Affairs for the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations, Chris Oswald, Head of Policy and Communications from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and Martin Rhodes, Director of the Scottish Fair Trade Forum. So, gentlemen, if I could start the proceedings this morning by asking you, to what extent were your organisations consulted on the provisions in the bill? By the Scottish Government, obviously. Anyway.
Well, speaking on behalf of my coalition, I was involved in a steering group that looked into the bill at the initial stages, so I had fairly extensive involvement myself from that. As far as my coalition was concerned, documents and information from that consultation was sent out to them. It's a very big, wide coalition, so within that wide coalition with limited resources, there were differing levels of engagement.
Okay, thanks. John?
Convener, I sit on the Deputy First Minister, chaired by the Deputy First Minister of the our Procurement Reform Advisory Group, which includes FSB, CCPS, Chambers of Commerce, and we obviously had over the past year quite intensive discussions with officials and around that table in terms of the group. I think in terms of the word consulted, I might take issue with, well, they did consult us. I don't think they actually listened. That's part of the problem, an inherent problem in the bill.
Okay, we'll come on to that. Martin?
Certainly, from the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, very similar to Stop Climate Chaos. We were involved in the steering group and obviously involved in the wider consultation process.
Okay.
Because the Equality and Human Rights Commission has a regulatory role as well as a policy development role, we weren't directly involved in the formulation of the bill. We did, however, respond to consultations, and we were working on our guidance jointly with the Scottish Government procurement team as the process of the bill was being developed. So I think we had some degree of influence there.
Okay, thanks. So, does the bill deliver the government's policy objectives of delivering social and environmental benefits, supporting innovation and promoting public procurement processes and systems which are transparent, streamlined, standardised, fair and business-friendly, to quote? Who's going to start? John?
Thank you, Convener. Yeah. I think I can think back to when Alec Neil was the Minister and he articulated his vision for the procurement bill in terms of, helping build resilient communities, local job creation. There was a real vision there that actually everybody bought into, because we'd taken a delegation in from the sector to talk to him about the bill. And actually, you were thinking at that point this bill was going to make a real difference in local communities. It was going to help us direct more of the procurement spend into local communities through the process. Now, over the period since then, I think that has been lost, and I think in our evidence we say, it's got a fundamental flaw. Actually, it fails to address what we're thinking here is what we're trying to achieve with procurement. How are we actually going to use it to benefit people and communities across Scotland? Because actually at the moment, the overriding factor in terms of economic growth, it is not working. I recently read a paper as part of the advisory group on procurement's contribution to sustainable economic growth. Now, even before I could get in, I mean, the guys from the health side of, of Scottish Government were in saying, well, what's it doing to address health inequalities? What's it doing to address a whole range of other issues? We're spending over £9 billion a year, and actually we are not directing that effectively to support local businesses, to local job creation. And I think that's where we have difficulties with the bill. Now, I can understand the vision and when you're doing the practical sense of a bill where the difficulties lie, but I think we've not got the fundamentals right in the bill and what we're actually trying to achieve. Because for us, I think if you're thinking about all these things, we've talked about people's well-being, spending the money in a different way, the secondary outcome is sustainable economic growth, because you're actually creating more jobs, you're getting more people off unemployment, but you're actually promoting better health outcomes as well. There's a whole range of factors here. The social impact that we talk about quite strongly in our evidence has been missed in that, and I think that's the fundamental flaw. And there's other issues surrounding that, I'm sure, will come up in questions.
Okay, well, I'm sure you'll be able to get them in again. Tom, you had your mic on.
Yes, I think we made concerns known really very early on in the consultation process, and I don't think those concerns have really been entirely addressed by what we've got in front of us. Primarily, without definitions in relation to environment and sustainability, it's very difficult to see how this will all work. We think that part of the crucial thing is that the definitions should include an idea of sustainable development and specifically living within environmental limits. The idea of living within environmental limits. The second kind of key thing for us is that you can talk about economic, social and environmental benefits, but unless you understand the place of each of those benefits in the kind of hierarchy in the mix, then inevitably it will be the economic benefit that will rise to the top, and the environmental will not be given its proper place, and particularly when it comes to climate emissions. So you start with the problem over the definition. You move on to the question of the place of environment in this hierarchy. And then, of course, finally, you have the issue of how will it be ensured that any beneficial outcomes on the environment are actually met? What are the monitoring mechanisms? What are the enforcement mechanisms?
If, for example, one of the key objectives is to promote local businesses and buy locally, is that not a sustainable environmental policy?
It is, but what I'm looking at is Section 8, where they're talking about considering these various benefits. So there's a procurement duty to consider economic, social and environmental benefits. But it's very easy to consider these things, but that doesn't mean that they're actually going to happen. And as I say, the concern is, and maybe I'm wrong, but the concern is that if you just consider them and you don't have anything behind that, don't have any understanding of what is meant, then what you will get is delivery of primarily economic benefits without really any acknowledgement of the social and the environmental.
Is that not something that's more likely to be contained in regulations and subsequent subordinate legislation by the very nature of the bill? It has to be fairly high level because it's covering such a wide range of procurement bodies. Well,
I think that's been put to me before, and certainly my hope is that if it's not covered here to my satisfaction, then when it comes further down the line there will be better coverage. But at the moment, without that initial definition of what we mean by sustainable development, it's difficult to see how the regulation and the guidance is going to flow naturally from what you've got at the top. So my submission would be at the top, you start with a very clear definition of what you're trying to achieve, you have some idea of the hierarchy within that, and then, yes, you move to strategy and guidance on how it's going to happen.
Okay, Martin. Bring it back in.
I think from the point of view of the forum, I think picking up a similar perspective to what Tom's just outlined there, which is that we would recognise, and your own comment as well, Convener, that guidance regulations, that would be the basis on which the detail of how we would achieve more fair trade procurement through the public sector would be set out and would be achieved. I think what the bill fails to offer to us is some statement of intent at the higher level, which from our point of view, the interest would be in Scotland's achievement of fair trade nation status earlier this year, and how procurement in the public sector could be used to strengthen that commitment, embed it in, and some statement of intent in the bill that sets that out would, I think, give greater confidence to procurement officers. And we recently held a conference with public sector procurement officers from local authorities, from higher education, from the health service and so on. And one of the things that came through there and has come through for a number of years when we have conversations with procurement officers is some clear statement at the top level that this is what we want to achieve, or one of the things we want to achieve through procurement, would give confidence to procurement officers to then get into the detail of how do you do that. And we're happy to work with the Scottish Government in terms of guidance to procurement officers and how they can do it within Scottish law, but also within EU law.
Chris, do you?
In a slightly different position in terms of equalities, because we have had since 2002 a series of requirements on public bodies in Scotland in terms of race and then disability and then gender. Procurement has always been defined as a public function for the purposes of equality legislation, and public bodies are already required in Scotland to pay due regard to the needs of equality in any procurement opportunity, whether irrespective of the size of the contract. So I think part of our concern at the Commission is that there is perhaps an ambiguity in this bill where procurement officers, and I take Martin's point exactly, our experience is that procurement officers are reluctant to use the equality clauses, perhaps because they don't understand them or because they feel that there's potentially in conflict with European law, which is incorrect. Our own research backs up that suggestion that there's a reluctance. We were unable to identify, when we looked at apprenticeships training, for example, and procurement opportunities there, positive examples of conditions, award criteria, and conditions being placed in contracts. So I think the issue of intent, to a certain extent in my field, is addressed through the Equality Act and through the public sector duties on equality. But there is still, I think, a confusion at procurement officer level and a reluctance to view that positively at this stage. I'm happy to expand on that later as we get more into the technical aspects of it.
That's interesting. John, did you want to come back on this?
It was just your point about definitions and guidance. I mean, obviously, very much this bill is an enabling bill, and it's heavily reliant on policy guidance. And I think, as some of your earlier evidence has pointed out, is the general provisions are very light on specifics. The duties are very ambiguous, and that becomes part of the problem because it's actually current guidance, and we all know in current procurement legislation, particularly around areas of social care, and Annie Gunnar-Logan has articulated that at a number of committees, which actually has not been followed. So it's very reliant on policy guidance, and that's very much down to interpretation and actually people following that guidance. And that, in practice and reality, doesn't happen as much as we would like.
Okay, then, if we go on to specifics, Alex, you've got some questions.
Convener, yes, moving on to the more specific aspects of the bill. First of all, do you think the bill applies to the right set of contracting authorities? Is there anybody in there that shouldn't be? Is there anybody that should be in there that isn't?
I mean, I think Scottish Water is the obvious example that perhaps should be in the bill. I mean, if we're looking at, it should be across all public bodies. So that would be generally our view.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a view on the Scottish Water's exclusion? Specifically, I wonder if there's a climate implication to that.
Well, I'm thinking as you were speaking, and it certainly seems surprising. You can imagine, a wide coalition, we don't always take a specific stance on a specific authority, so I'm not really in a position to say yes or no to anything. What I could say is that I guess in principle we would want these provisions to apply as widely as possible. And I don't think I would be kind of authorised to go any further than that.
Yes. If anything comes to mind, you could always let us know. I was also going to ask, in general terms, do you support the introduction of the new regime for below EU threshold contracts? And what are your views on the specific level of thresholds introduced with the bill?
I mean, we haven't taken a view in terms of that. I mean, I think picking up on that question and the previous question, our view would be that in terms of the authorities to be covered and in terms of the levels, as wide and as far-reaching from our point of view would be welcome, recognising that there are constraints in terms of what can be done and other constraints with regard to procurement other than our interest, but our interest would be that in terms of the fair trade responsibility and duty we think public sector bodies should have, that should be as wide as possible.
I think, as we said in our evidence, we support the inclusion of national thresholds, but I think it's a bit unclear the differentiation these thresholds are actually creating in terms of the bill. I mean, for example, it's not clear how the threshold of 50,000 will lead to a differentiation between contracts above and below it. And if we're having a threshold, as other European countries have, we've got to be very clear that below that threshold there is a slightly lighter regime. I mean, we quote in the example in our evidence of France where it's £90,000, where below that there is a lighter touch, if I can put it like that, procurement process, where actually there's a lot of trust in the commissioning body, whether that's a local authority or another public body, actually saying, deciding on the outcomes they want, hopefully in conjunction with service users and perhaps suppliers, a co-production approach, and actually then deciding, you know, who's best placed to deliver that contract. And that happens across Europe. Once you go above that 90,000 and slightly below the European threshold, you can have a slightly more detailed procedure, but then above the threshold you go through the full contract. I think what we're saying here is if you've got a contract for £30,000, we shouldn't be doing the same procurement process as if it's a contract for £300,000. We need to differentiate, and that needs to be clear in the bill as well.
I noticed you also did some comparisons with Greece, which I'm not sure entirely the right place to go. But do you think it is appropriate for us to look at how it's done in other European countries and try and match the level?
I think we should. I think there's a lot of research being done. Certainly, we have a report on file somewhere that's a comparator to European countries. So actually, we can look at that and actually see how it works. And I think even if you look at, you know, how other countries call it design their contracts and write the contracts perfectly legible to actually benefit, you know, take social impact, which is used widely across Europe, into consideration. And that's where we're taking, well, I mean, a good example recently is obviously where UK companies lost the contract to build trains down in, was it Derby or Bolton? And actually, when a similar contract went in Germany, well, the German companies, the way that contract was written, it could only be a German company that won that contract. But actually, because they were considering the social impact of putting in Derby 400 people on the dole and out of work. And actually, we need to consider those factors within procurement as well. It's not just a matter of cost. We need to look at, one, the value of the contract, the quality we're getting, the outcomes we're delivering, but actually, what's the impact on our local communities and local people? Because at the end of the day, it'll end up costing us more.
Picking up on what can we learn from across Europe, certainly from our perspective, yes, there is lots to be learned from across Europe in terms of different examples and very different approaches to fair trade and procurement right across Europe, and valuable lessons that could be learned. At the same time, I think one of the important things is that Scotland can be a leader with regard to fair trade. The fair trade nation status, only the second country in the world to achieve that after Wales, means that Scotland can lead the way in this. And certainly there are examples already in Scotland of some innovative approaches to fair trade and procurement in the public sector. We would quite happily work with the Scottish Government in terms of looking at how that has been done and how that practice can be shared through guidance that the Scottish Government could put out to local authorities and other public sector bodies.
Keen to get views on the thresholds as well, if you're saying that.
In terms of the Equality Act, economic thresholds do not apply. It's a proportionality argument. So the issue is about the impact on equality, and I think there is a resonance here with others. So one concern we would have about the introduction of thresholds is it potentially causes confusion between the Equality Act and the procurement regime, which is intended to be introduced. I'll give you an example. For example, just a number of local authorities and other public bodies outsource staff support. And these can be quite small contracts, £3,000 for, say, 100 hours of staff support. But the nature of the contract and what's being delivered is very personal. And so the person who is providing it, you would want to stipulate, has knowledge of, say, harassment at work or domestic abuse or transgender issues, because it's an intimate service that's being provided. So I think it's less, from my point of view, it's less about the threshold and more about the purpose of the contract and what is actually being procured here. So I think it's a slightly different principle from that of arbitrary numbers, but actually focusing much more on what is the purpose of this contract. Now, obviously, in any of these considerations, there's a proportionality argument. So you do not just introduce equality conditions for the sake of it. You have to be able to justify them. But it's a process of thinking it through, and that's done through a quality impact assessment in the same way as it could be done through an environmental impact assessment.
Yep.
Can I just ask, I mean, why do you think it is that other countries are seen, and as you have described, obviously manage to stay within EU rules and deliver the contracts to their own national companies within their own jurisdictions?
I think part of it, convener, is the when they look at the cost-benefit analysis and they look at the risk factors. I mean, long experience at the civil service at UK and Scottish level, we try to build all the risk out of every every guidance, every legislation, everything we do. And actually, there will be risk there. I mean, interesting within this debate is about the living wage as well. And actually, I've read some of the earlier evidence to the committee where people are quoting the London situation, and we're all aware they were willing to take the risk that someone would challenge them, but actually on balance they thought someone wouldn't. And actually they introduced it on the basis of the fact that we felt this was a good thing to do and we could do it. Whereas in terms of Scotland, we asked the European Commission, can we do this? And perhaps instead of saying to them, we want to do this, how do we actually do it within legislation and taking a different proactive approach? Because, and it's about that risk. It's a risk factor. We're trying to build out every risk of procurement. And actually, you talk to procurement professionals, and around some of the procurement reform groups that the Scottish Government's got, it's one of the biggest issues about legal challenges. And that's how they judge the efficiency of the procurement system, is less legal challenges. Well, actually, I don't think that's a particularly good measure of how the procurement system should actually work. And I think you can't build out risk. What we want to do here is empower staff and public bodies to make the right decision based on getting the right outcomes locally. And hopefully, as I say, that's in a co-production approach with service users, taking the principles of Christie and actually making sure that the public services, we're designing them through a procurement system are delivering the best outcome, because at the moment they aren't.
And in your experience, you maybe not be able to answer this question, but we can probably find out. Are there lots of legal challenges at a EU level?
In different countries, you look at it, there are some, because they perhaps take more of a risk. France is seen as taking more of a risk with stuff, but relatively, I don't think the numbers that high, and I think it's something that we're worrying too much about. And actually, if we're empowering, using the threshold measure to empower public officials and public bodies under £90,000 to go through a process where they're getting 3 to 5 quotes for a contract, they've thought about the outcomes, and they can justify the people, the best organisation, whether it's public, private or third sector, deliver that, then that is, clearly a proposition that elected members should then vote for other senior officials and put it into place. But it's about it's all of this is a judgment. But what we're trying to do is take a judgment out of it, and that's actually putting the system into disrepute, if I can use that word.
Okay. Right, if we move on to part 2, which is general duties and procurement strategies, Gordon, you've got some questions on this.
Yep, thanks very much, Convener. In your opening remarks, we touched upon your views on the sustainable procurement duty, and some of the comments that were made was that we only have to consider the sustainable procurement duty, and if my understanding is right, that we have to have clearer statements and policy guidance. Now, in the evidence we got from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, it said that the 2004 Public Sector Directive on Equality in Public Sector Contracts, they stated that they found no examples of that being used. How can we beef up the legislation so that the sustainable procurement duty is not ignored, similar to what happened with the Public Sector Directive?
I don't necessarily think there's an issue of the legislation. I think it's similar to what's already been said, is that it's about the confidence amongst procurement officers to be clear that they will not be challenged. I think there's perhaps more of a sense that they will be challenged rather than evidence that there are innumerable challenges being made. There's a reluctance and a conservatism. The research that we did and that we quoted in our own submission was quite specific to a particular area, which is about skills development and training, where we had a particular concern in research that we published earlier this year about apprenticeships. So I think that, and again, I think the issue for myself is less about thresholds, but about the utility of what's being bought, how close, what environmental gains could be made, what social gains could be made, rather than the actual figure that we're talking about. And I think that potentially is a distraction. I can see it's an administrative, it's tidy administratively, but actually the focus should be much more on about what are we actually wanting to achieve through this. And in terms of equality, it isn't just about eliminating discrimination. The duty is also on public bodies to advance equality, so to use this to redress past injustices, and also to have an impact on community relations, so that we don't want to see imbalances or senses of unfairness growing in communities. So I think there's a model here which potentially could be further explored. It's also, in terms of equality, a slightly tighter test in terms of due regard. Due regard in case law now means a conscious direction of the mind. It seems a slightly clumsy phrase, but that's what the courts came up with. But essentially it means you take seriously the implications on equality, and you can be challenged if you don't.
I think that for us, in terms of the bill, it is about setting that confidence in place for then the guidance, and the detailed guidance will deal with the process. But the confidence is so important, and the reason why I say that is the experience that we have talking to and working with local authorities, universities, schools, colleges, is those who have, at the high level, the political leadership that says, we want you to do this. Here is a clear statement, a policy statement. Here is a document. Here is a public statement by the leadership of this local authority or by the people at the top of the university administration. Then procurement officers will then sit down and look at the guidance and have the confidence to do what they need to do. And I think it's important that a lot of the time I'm conscious that it can sound as if we are criticising overly cautious procurement officers. I actually say that's not the fault of the procurement officers, that's the fault of the organisations in which they work, by not setting that framework. And I think the bill for us offers the opportunity to clearly state what the intent is with regard to these social duties, and give the confidence then to people working at the front line in terms of procurement to deliver.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. I think I've already alluded to the idea that we have a clearer definition of what we mean by sustainable. But secondly, an easy way into this is something similar to what you have in Section 31 about recycled goods, where you require people to buy a certain number of recycled goods or things coming from that. You could have a similar provision in relation to goods procured and their the emissions attributable to them. You could put duties on suppliers and procurers in that regard, and that would achieve a similar end. That would beef up the kind of meeting of the environmental target. But beyond that, I agree very much that a lot of this is going to come down to how the guidance is framed, what training is offered, and the confidence of procurers that actually, if they do the environmentally good thing, if you like, they will not find that someone's coming down on like a ton of bricks saying you should have looked at the cost first.
Okay.
And so if we get this guidance is framed correctly and we give that confidence, do you feel that the provisions in the bills assist the third sector organisations to bid for public contracts more easily?
I think potentially. I think potentially if we get that right. I mean, obviously, if we look at part of our evidence, it was about separating the buying of things and the buying of services, and particularly around the third sector are supplying services. And I think that's where one of the big issues is. You can't, from our view, you can't buy tables and chairs and glasses and stuff in the same way as you buy people services, social care, for example, mental health services, alcohol harm reduction, and a whole range of other things. You need to do that in a much different way. And I think what we would say is here, I think the bill has that potential if we can, from the committee's evidence, the committee's report, we can address some of the, the inadequacies in the moment and actually think about where we want to take this, because it's fast becoming a missed opportunity, and actually we need to turn that around and take it as an opportunity to, deliver more opportunities for local businesses, for the third sector, local job creation, and do more around it. I think we can, but it needs some, fundamental reworking.
Could I ask, just can you be specific about the reworking that's required?
Well, I think one of the things I've just said there is the separation and making it very clear when you're buying people services and you're buying tables, chairs, computers. We need to separate that. That fundamentally needs to be in the provisions of the bill, because otherwise we're going to use the same. We're going to use the same procurement process. That's one very specific example there. The thresholds issues we touched upon. Let's make it clear there are different ways of doing procurement under the different thresholds, and actually given, as Martin was saying, local procurement staff the confidence and they empower them to actually make the right decisions. So there are things that can be specifically put in the bill that will help the process and take things forward.
Well, I understand where you're coming from. You're obviously looking for a culture change within the procurement processes, and the bill is an opportunity to perhaps set out the mission, if you like, to do that. But what I'm looking to you for is actually to spell out precisely how we do that in the legislation, or is it does it go beyond the legislation? Well,
we've had a number of interesting discussions recently with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth asked us to do a survey into long-term funding in the sector. In my view, you can't talk about long-term funding for the third sector without bringing procurement into it. And we've had a couple of very positive discussions with COSLA and Directors of Finance around that. I've taken 2 delegations in from the sector to talk to them, and we had a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary as well. And actually, but a lot of those discussions hinge on cultural and behavioural issues. And I think the Cabinet Secretary said that at the end of the meeting himself. And actually that can't be changed by legislation. That, as Martin said, is what's happening in organisations, what's driven from the top in terms of the leadership saying we want to promote positive social outcomes here, we want to make a difference to our local community, we want to be more sustainable, fair trade, and as Chris said, we want to use equalities legislation to enhance people's well-being. But that's got to be driven by the public bodies and the leadership themselves. You can't legislate for the cultural change, behavioural change needed within this. You can set a framework, and you can perhaps, change the ground rules, which can help make it happen. But it's what happens after this bill. You can have the best bill in the world, but if culture and behaviour doesn't change, then it becomes meaningless. So it's actually what happens after the bill, if we get that right, is the most important, and that's where Scottish Government needs to invest time and effort, alongside the trade unions, ourselves and other organisations as well, to make sure we can take the opportunity of the bill to change things for the future. But behaviour and cultural change will be the heart of it.
Okay, fine, I understand that, but I'm just looking for the instruments to actually achieve that. How do we actually achieve that? Failing getting everyone together in a room and telling them what to do.
Well,
I mean, there is provision in the bill for mentioning training, and certainly in the evidence we've gathered out with here, there are certainly pretty well-trained procurers out there, but it's spreading that further.
Well, Convener, I mean, the committee probably knows that the Scottish Government had a contract out called Developing Markets, where a consortium were out working with third sector organisations and procurers, and actually trying to bring them together to enhance our knowledge about the third sector, do that kind of culture change you were talking about. They've actually just put the second contract out and awarded it, which interestingly took no consideration of the new procurement bill, took no consideration of a changing environment around self-directed support. So, the first one had no evaluation. We never knew any outcomes, whether it was actually working to change behaviour and culture. And we've now got a second contract out, which frankly, we're just wasting money, because we need to see what happens here before we can take that forward. But I think we can work, the mechanisms can be worked out, but it is about how do we create better relationships between service users, because I think we need to put service users at the heart of procurement, providers, public, private and third sector, and actually the commissioning body and what outcomes we want to see. It won't be easy.
Martin?
Yeah, I think in terms of you're looking for, specific issues we have in terms of making clear the intent and making clear in terms of, in particular, obviously around fair trade, is in the sustainable procurement duty as the definition of area. And currently, in terms of the way in which the bill it refers to the area by reference to which the contracting authority primarily exercises functions, disregarding any areas outside Scotland. I think we have concerns about that. Many of the products that we will be talking about in terms of fair trade are coming in from outside of Scotland. I'm quite sure that the bill is not intended to say you have to buy your tea, coffee and bananas from Scottish sources. But I think there is a danger in terms of this was about setting confidence that if you set that wording there, the procurement officers then become very wary about anything which they may see as going outside of their area if you define it as geographic. Now, I understand it can be obviously seen as, I think what we would like to see is it looking at it as an area, as a thematic area, because many of the products that we're talking about coming in from the developing world are clearly not in any way in competition with products that are coming from within Scotland or within the local area. So I think that's an area, definition of area would be something that I think we have some concerns about in terms of the current wording of the bill.
Yes, Mr. Banton.
Just to make it clear that we share the same concern, but for all different reasons relating to emissions and how you account for emissions.
In relation to what you said, Ms. Martin, we've had submissions about companies, Scottish-based companies that import fair trade products, maybe not getting a fair crack of the whip.
Sure. Certainly the principle in terms of fair trade is trade. We're not talking here about some sort of charitable giving. Therefore, it is potentially beneficial to both sides in terms of all parts of that supply chain. So it may well be that obviously the primary focus is around the farmers and producers in the developing world, but there are benefits to, in many cases, SMEs, we were talking about level companies within Scotland as well, who do trade with fair trade producers in the developing world. And we're looking in terms of that mutual benefit from fair trade.
And then there's obviously also the question of sourcing food locally from local farmers, as, for example, Murray and I think East Ayrshire, North Ayrshire are very good at doing. So that comes under fair trade as well, does it not?
It wouldn't come in terms of our definition of fair trade, because our concern is with regard to the developing world and farmers there. But I think we do a lot of work with local producers here in Scotland, because many of the concerns that people have in terms of where their food comes from, both maybe health concerns, but it may also be in terms of how was this produced, what was the are the same concerns with regard to sourcing locally as sourcing ethically from elsewhere. And as I mentioned, in terms of it's the type of product we're talking about. In terms of some food items are not available sourced locally. So we work very closely with those people looking at the sourcing of food locally. But in some cases, that's not what can be achieved simply in terms of what's produced here.
Tom and then John.
You mentioned the East Ayrshire School Meals Programme, which I know a little bit about, and that's a really good example of a situation where if you included the possibility of regulations to say that you have to procure a certain amount of goods meeting certain emission standards, that kind of scheme would come straight into that. And what they do there is they have 30% organic, 50% locally produced, and 75% unprocessed food. It seems to have been welcomed both by the children, the community, and everyone concerned with that particular venture. So if you're talking about providing mechanisms to give procurers confidence to do these sort of things, there is a prime example of where a thing like that could be encouraged and a lot more of it happen.
It's maybe referring back to Mr Ingram's point earlier about some of the specifics around how we can change the culture. I mean, a number of city councils, south of the border, have been working quite closely with their supply chain. And one of the issues they were trying to address was making sure that suppliers understood their objectives very clearly. So if they wanted to, have more sustainable transport, better, fresher school meals, they wanted to create employment in certain areas. And actually, that understanding with suppliers had actually helped. And there was one company who was supplying large school meals, but they were delivering them from outside the area, and decided to create a local plant in a deprived area where they could create some jobs for actually making the food and then actually delivering from there. So actually, there were shorter journey times, but the whole point of it was because they understood the city council's objectives about more employability, more sustainability, lower carbon emissions. Actually, they were able to win that contract for the second time much more effectively, and that was about that engagement and both sides understanding where they came from. And I think we need to do a lot more of that. And there seems to have been certainly we've been talking to a number of people who work in procurement south of the border, where there's examples where that understanding has actually helped create jobs locally. It was still a large company who won the contract, but actually what they did was, instead of having one big centre, they were actually moving themselves into that city council area, creating jobs, and supplying locally in effect rather than supplying nationally. And that was a kind of cultural change that can work.
Okay. Tom.
Yeah, just final point again, that East Ayrshire scheme is a very good example of where there was a hierarchy created in procurement, because what they said was they still, I think it was 50% of, there was a point system, 50% of the points went on cost, 15% went on environment, 15%. So they essentially created a hierarchy. They gave the procurers confidence to use that hierarchy, and they got the result.
Okay. Mary, I'm mindful that quite a lot of the points that you wanted to cover in terms of ECHR and maybe fair trade has been covered, but yes. I'll let you in if there's anything else you want to ask.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the fair trade stuff has been covered. If I could perhaps ask if you see if there's any conflict between the sustainable procurement duty and the general duties to treat suppliers without discrimination and to act in a transparent and proportionate manner. How do you think contracting authorities will resolve this?
I think that when it comes to dealing with things in a proportionate manner and looking at the issues of transparency, it all comes back to what your initial criteria are for your procurement. So if you set your correct definition at the beginning, I don't see that there would be any contradiction between a sustainable goal and other goals.
So it's just about setting the standard or the goal in the right place.
Yes, I would say so.
Wording it correctly. Yeah.
I would say so.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I think I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. And do you welcome the proposals on procurement strategies and annual reports? And what's your view on strategies and reports?
Yes, I think I absolutely welcome the requirement for reports and the like, but I think they will only be valuable if, again, they have clear guidelines on what you're expecting to see in reports, and specifically that there's some indication as to the value to be put on environment and social, as well as economic outcomes.
John?
Very much welcome the idea, similar to what's just been said. I think What we would also like to see, and I think it picks up on the point just being made about making clear what's required in terms of the guidelines, in terms of what should be in those reports. And if that's clear, what we could then take from that is some sort of national report which takes all that information, brings all that information together. And we'd like to see that as well in terms of some national report which actually looks at what's being achieved through procurement, so it can be measured and monitored year on year, where improvements have been made.
I mean, certainly that was an issue that's come up before. While most of our previous witnesses have agreed that a report is a good idea, who is going to monitor that report and what action will come out of that report? And I think that's really important.
I think I would agree with that. I think it's that, getting that fundamental right is what you're trying to achieve with procurement, whether you're a local authority, public body. And actually, if you can articulate that, and that's the driver for the report, and actually you're measuring a whole range of outcomes. As I said earlier, it's less for me about the efficiency of the system and more about, is it that procurement creating local jobs, reducing health inequalities and addressing a whole range. Now, those measures may be different they will be different for different public bodies, and in different local authorities, some are further ahead in a transition to a low carbon economy than others. So actually, how do we then measure issues like that? And it's what we measure will be the key. So it makes it valuable to try and redirect that spend in the future. But I do think it will need someone, independent's not quite the right word, but someone to monitor and look at it in an effective manner.
That what's in the report, if it's monitored, could build the strategy to make it stronger.
Yeah, I think also, as well as having your report, a lot will depend on what the implications are if you don't actually meet your responsibilities. I mean, we already have duties under the Climate Change Act on sustainability. I'm just reading a report from Transform Scotland about doing their duty and about transport, where very few local authorities have any plans really to reduce their emissions from transport. Very large numbers are still flying as opposed to taking trains down to London. So those kind of things, if you put them into your reporting system, people will then go and say, well, what happens if I don't meet these particular responsibilities?
Again, in respect of equality, there are already duties to report on this in terms of reporting on a mainstreaming duty, and I wouldn't want particularly to be encouraging more further and further layers of reporting. So where we can integrate this, it would be helpful. I think something at the edges of this, which concerns me, is that potentially we have two different regimes in place. One which is dealing with equality, which is about protected groups, men, women, ethnic minorities, disabled people, and one which is about social inequality, which we would predominantly talk about deprivation. And it's potentially we could have a situation with this bill where you have thresholds in play about social inequality, but you have no thresholds in play about protected groups. So I think we need to be clearer about what we're actually trying to achieve, because I think it would not be helpful, particularly from my end. We would be concerned if procurement officers defaulted to the thresholds rather than to the sense of the Equality Act. But I can see a sense of unfairness being generated by having two very different approaches being in play, with the Equality Act looking at the purpose of the contract and the Procurement-Reform Bill looking at the size of the contract, its financial components. And I think there's perhaps a way round, a way through this, which is actually to focus more to the extent in what John's talking about in terms of what is the purpose. Is this about buying physical goods, or is it about buying support services? It's that type of area where I think there could be perhaps more exploration.
So do you think there's any guidance in the bill?
Guidance helps, but I think from my own experience of working both in race disability and now across all strands, guidance in itself has not changed culture. What we are seeing more is that by creating or facilitating networks of positive procurement practice, we then encourage and drive up standards. It's about officers being confident in what they're doing, and I think the often European legislation is seen as being a massive inhibitor, unjustly. The inhibitions are not there, the prohibitions are not there, but there's a cultural sense in procurement that there are things you can and cannot do. which we would want to get passed. There are some very positive examples of procurement that we've seen recently. The ScotRail franchise, in terms of its approach to disability, is, I would say, is a very good one. I wouldn't want to comment on the extent to which environmentally it's a good one. So there are positive examples out there of how we can drive up standards and how we can meet people's needs. But they are not, I would suggest, the common factor that you see across all procurement.
So do you think it comes back to the element of training that procurement officers have and awareness of what they can and cannot do within the risk of breaching European regulations? Is that a training issue?
I think training certainly helps, but I think also leadership and having positive role models in this area helps enormously as well. Having seen somebody else take a risk and be successful and have to have good outcomes, and this is where the reporting thing comes back. Reporting about the positive outcomes that you have had encourages other people round about you to change their practice as well.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just... Sorry.
Briefly.
Yeah, just as a gloss on that, we're talking about positive outcomes, when we're talking about the environmental, I think it's particularly important that one looks beyond just the economic and sees the other positive, the health benefits, the multiple benefits. And if procurers understood or if procurers were able to take into account those wider benefits, then that would make it much easier for them to make better procurement decisions.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, if we move on to specific duties then, Jim.
Thank you, Convener. Before I do that, I wonder if I could see if I can pin the witnesses down on a couple of points that have come up in their evidence this morning. First, I could start with Mr Ballantyne. What specific duties do you see that could be placed on contracting authorities that would achieve the environmental objectives that you seek? So you talked about the need to get the definition right in terms of sustainable procurement. But I'm just wondering, when it comes to evaluating the environmental costs and benefits when awarding contracts, is there a specific duty that the bill could introduce?
Well, you're probably aware of a number of points that we've raised on this front, and essentially when we're talking about sustainability and therefore the duties that flow through the bill, we've given 5 guiding principles of sustainable development, which are already agreed by the Scottish Government, and the first of those is living within environmental limits. So I think the first point is to actually include a proper definition of what you mean by sustainable. From that, I agree there is, and I've had several discussions over the months about where precisely you put your guidance, whether how much of it can come in the Act, how much of it can come in strategy, and how much in guidance. And I wouldn't profess to have a wording today that would deal with that. But what I think we would help and would undoubtedly deliver is the kind of thing we have on recycled goods, the idea that you can have regulations for recycled goods. You could have something similar for suppliers who are meeting effectively reduced emissions targets.
How would you actually evaluate that? How would procurement officers be able to evaluate what the cost and environmental costs and benefits were when making those procurement decisions?
Because what you would do is you would have a duty or you'd ask the suppliers to provide an annual assessment of carbon emissions attributable to their business, to provide information on the carbon emissions attributable to the whole life of goods and services supplied. And when you're looking at the procurer, you could, as I say, require the procurer to procure a certain quantity of goods meeting those standards, worked out on the basis of the information you've been given.
That's helpful. Can I ask Mr Downey, you said that we needed to use the bill to drive and direct procurement spend into communities, and if I heard you correctly and if I read your evidence correctly, one way in which we could do that is to have a faster procurement process below a certain threshold, and the 50,000 threshold was mentioned. Can you just give us a specific on how we would achieve that? Sorry, are you looking to to have a specific amendment to the bill that would achieve that?
I think we would probably have that threshold. I mean, the bill talks about a threshold here, but I think, as I said earlier, that there's not a clear differentiation between the different procurement processes either side of that line. And I think what we need in the bill is actually a clearer but whatever threshold is set, whether it's 50,000 or 90,000, is actually, you need to say, this is how we operate below that. This is how, procuring staff can actually work. And it's that, because at the moment there doesn't seem to be any difference between procuring under the threshold and actually procuring over the threshold. And I think it's something that has come up in earlier evidence. It's this thing between, commissioning and tendering, and particularly around social care at the moment is given, there is certainly a drive to say, let's give, commissioning bodies the choice between we want to commission this service actually, or do we want to put it out to tender. Now, it depends on the framework you set around that. And certainly, I think things are changing. When I was talking about those long-term funding meetings, there was a director of social work from, a large Scottish council, and he was saying the framework they had created around social care procurement was actually designed to bring smaller niche players who usually from the third sector into that framework and enable them to, compete's not the right word, but able to, bid for contracts and or actually work with a larger social care supplier to put in a bid, because they're supplying the very niche services that people need and the general services provided by something else. So actually, for me, that's where, there is, as Chris said, there are actually some good examples where procurement at a local level is actually, driving forward change. I mean, as he said himself, the system's not yet perfect, but actually it was a way forward of actually changing the dynamic amongst, in his view, his supply chain. And I think enabling him to do more of that is about this distinction between, I want to be able to commission that, or I'll tender here, but actually having a different system above and below the threshold would be very helpful and very clear. And as I said, let's say use the word lighter touch below whatever threshold.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm sure that's an issue we'll return to. Can I just ask each of the witnesses to say quickly if they have a view on the requirement to place contracts above a certain threshold on the Public Contracts Scotland website?
I think I agree. I think, making all the information is accessible to as many people as possible and gives everyone the opportunity is fine.
Yeah, I think the more transparency and openness you can have in the process, the better. So if it's a way of achieving that, yes.
Yeah, I agree.
From my own organisation's position, every procurement opportunity, irrespective of its size, is advertised openly.
That's helpful. If I can move on to community benefit requirements, are you generally supportive of those and the level of the contracts to which they apply, and any thoughts on how that section of the bill could be strengthened?
I think in terms of the level, I think sometimes it's how we actually think what a community benefit clause is, because actually technically you could build in a community benefit clause to any size of contract as long as it's proportionate, because it may be, for example, if the contract's worth 25,000, the community benefit is £500, and that could be directed to donation to a local playgroup. There are different ways of doing it. Obviously, what we tend to think of this is, it's in large-scale contracts, how do we then bring in, a wider and more larger-scale community benefit? So I think we need to rethink what we mean by community benefit and the proportionality across all types of contracts. But actually, lots of, if you take the private sector, lots of small and medium-sized organisations are delivering lots of community benefit anyway. They may be sponsoring a local school team, the local choir. There's a whole range of things that they do locally, taking on local kids through, work-type programmes. So there's a lot they're doing which is community benefit. How you might want to measure that in local contracts and have it clearer would be good. In terms of the third sector, we would say, all the stuff we're delivering is community benefit in that sense. But actually, within those contracts, I think we need a wider rethink. I think the level is probably at the moment too high. I'd like to see community benefit as a measure throughout, all types of contracts and how we would actually deliver that. But I think that's why we talk quite heavily in our evidence, and I've talked today about, is the wider social impact, because that's taking community benefit to the next level, the more strategic level.
Anyone else?
As you've probably gathered, I'm not. I'm concerned about the use of thresholds here, and again, to look at the way that the Equality Act operates. That if you look at, firstly, you look at the extent to which this procurement opportunity is relevant to equality, or in John's case, to community benefits. If you feel it is, then you go forward and you set award criteria, and then you monitor that in terms of performance conditions as you go forward. I'm slightly anxious about lighter touch approaches, because I don't think it is about the value of the contract. It's about the utility and purpose of the contract that we need to focus on. And certainly the word discretion tends to cause anxiety amongst people in the equality and human rights professions, because we've seen negative examples of discretion being used. But if you have a structure which says, what is the purpose of this? What are the potential benefits that we have? And then, is it proportionate to build in award criteria and to monitor the performance conditions? That's the structure that's in place for equalities just now. And I would hope that we get some read across in the bill, because what I would not want to do, selfishly, from my point of view, is to see the equality provisions watered down by thresholds being introduced.
Okay. That's helped. We've already seen a tension here within the debate. But can I just, if anyone has...
I don't think it's actually a tension. I think what Chris was saying about actually deciding on what are the right outcomes. Part of the problem at the moment is with the different thresholds. I mean, I chair a social enterprise, and give a good example. We were talking to 3 different local authorities in the one big geographical area. You know, one was not interested in what we were doing. One commissioned it. It was worth £25,000. It was below their threshold, and the other local authority decided to put it out to tender. And it was exactly the same offer, same service, and you're wondering why is one bothering to tender it out at that level, and the other one is straightforwardly commissioning it because they felt that delivers a good service. We've seen the track record of it. It's worked locally. And I think for a lot of suppliers in the third, private sector and others, it's clarity around some of that. But actually, it's deciding what you want to achieve. And I think, I mean, I would agree with Chris, it is about, you know, it's what are the outcomes. And I'm confident in that people locally and in public bodies working within the right framework can actually decide on that.
Okay, can I move on to ask about workforce issues? I mean, the bill gives the government the power to instruct contracting authorities to have due regard to workforce issues, such as the inappropriate use of zero-hour contracts and the unacceptable practice of blacklisting. Do you have any views?
Certainly, we're totally opposed to blacklisting. I mean, I think this, you know, I think we've all, we're one of the organisations signed up to the 10 asks from across, you know, civil society with the trade unions and others. In terms of 0 hours contract, it's quite, I mean, it's an interesting one. You know, I remember when those workers were called sessional workers. I think I was one myself at one stage. In terms of, and I think they are used in the third sector relatively, you know, in a minority. You know, maybe 20% of organisations might use them, and some of that is actually at the request of workers as well. So there's a flexibility there, but actually the issue is about having choice. And as a person doing that through their own choice, are they being forced into it? And I think a lot of the 0 hours contracts we're seeing at the moment in the private sector is where people were forced into it and they don't have any choice. But it's got to be that balance where it's choice. But in general, I think
I was asking specifically about the inappropriate use, accepting.
Well, inappropriate use we're against, yeah. But the appropriate use, yeah, we're in favour of.
Anyone else?
No.
No, thank you.
All right, Mark.
Yeah, just on workforce-related issues, do you think this bill's ambitious enough in dealing with workforce-related issues, and specifically in terms of the living wage?
I'm happy to go for. I don't think it is. I think, you know, we can introduce and we should introduce the living wage through this bill. You know, talking to a number of local authority, council leaders, I mean, they understand completely in terms of, let's say, social care provision, that they can't put living wage into contracts, particularly for third sector providers at the moment. But if we're in a situation where we have a public services workforce, and that's across the third sector, the private sector and the public sector, and the councils are paying living wage to their own workers, but they won't put it in a contract and account for it and allocate funding in a contract for a third sector organisation to pay the living wage to their staff, then for that contract we need to think about how we actually, the inherent unfairness of that. But I think within the bill, it's about, do we think we'll get challenged on it? Do we think it's going to be an issue? I mean, people have raised in terms of the private sector, and we might think it's an issue, but as long as there's a level playing field, I think everybody will be happy with it. I certainly think we should use the opportunity to implement the living wage. And actually, I know that the implications of that in terms of, the Cabinet Secretary talking to local authorities about their allocation of funding, but how much is it going to cost us, and what will the benefit be to those low-paid workers, and if you take local economies as well, because that's where they're going to spend. You can actually see the benefits outweigh the risks.
Currently, in terms of equalities legislation, you can take account of previous findings of discrimination against an organisation in procurement. But given that there is not a huge level of discrimination claims coming through, that only really deals with the negative consequences. I think, like John, there are opportunities here to, certainly perhaps in award criteria, to encourage things like flexible working, living wages, and other areas which we see as being beneficial, as part of to encourage organisations to adopt policies and procedures, whether they could actually be enforced in the sense of this is the one thing that tips in the favour of one organisation. I doubt, but I think there's a very positive role that procurement could play in terms of helping to develop things like flexible working, diversity of the workforce, as two examples.
The government have said repeatedly that that they wouldn't be putting a requirement on the living wage within the bill for legal reasons, and have said that they would use guidance to encourage employers to pay the living wage. Do you think that's enough? Do you think that's going to be enough to see the sea change in paying conditions that we hope to achieve across Scotland? Okay, thanks. I'll move on to another part of the bill, and it's around transparency, which was covered before, but this is covering transparency after the contract has been awarded, and just to ask if you agree with the proposals around provision of debrief information to allow bidders for contracts to get feedback on where they've went wrong and where they can improve for their next bid.
I think the more communication between commissioners and tenderers and actually suppliers is actually a good thing, and I think we need to see more of that at an earlier stage before contracts as well as after. Thinking about so that, as I said earlier, and the example I was giving from south of the border, where people understand what the objectives are of that public body, which will help them then bid for a contract. And certainly if you lose out, if I can put it like that, then you should actually be told why your bid wasn't good enough, where the areas that you failed were. And so I think the more communication, the building relationships, will actually help and take away complaints, and it'll allow people to learn from past experience and be better prepared the next time around.
I think in general we would be supportive of anything which makes the process as transparent as possible. I think in terms of one of the big drivers for positive social change is when people see and the process is more transparent at every level, and that could be in terms of the relationship and the discussions between those putting out the tenders and those bidding for it, and actually, in terms of from our own perspective, people seeing that there is a positive effect in terms of putting in that tender around including social criteria in terms of what you... Actually, that can be a driver to make real improvement in what we get out of public procurement in terms of the social criteria. So anything at all that improves the transparency of the process, I think we would generally be supportive of.
Adam.
Yeah, just to wrap up, just a couple of specific questions on sections of the bill. Could I ask what your views are on section 31 of the bill, which, in other words, are you supportive of those proposals on the procurement of recycled and recyclable products? Okay.
Well, you've already heard me earlier on welcoming that particular clause, and my only real comment beyond that is to say that it could be extended elsewhere. I have no further comment on that.
Tom said yes. Have you got anything further to add? No?
No.
The others? No, that's fine. Okay. Oh, sorry, Mark.
I mean, just to pick up on that point on where section 1 could be, section 31 could be extended elsewhere, do you think a similar amendment to section 10 on supported business, where section 31 says that the government will set out regulations that a specific portion of recyclable and products can be used? I think it would be appropriate for section 10 on a specific proportion of contracts being awarded to supported businesses.
I've always tended, I think, into being kind of two minds on that one. I mean, it always sounds, you know, perfectly reasonable, actually. But you're then having to make sure that that pool of potential supported businesses, you know, meet the quality, meet the criteria, and can deliver what you want. I mean, I chair a social enterprise, and social enterprise has been mentioned in that. But there's wide variations in, you know, and the different types of social enterprises. Some community, some larger. So I think it's given everybody the opportunity to bid and be part of the process, and I think that's built on the kind of cultural relationship change. I'm very wary of actually saying that 10% of all contracts should be designated to particular types of organisations. Does that just mean organisations change their, you know, their formation to suit that and actually meet that criteria? So I think it's something I think we need to be very wary of.
I think there's a problem with the definition of supported businesses as it stands, because there's a number of organisations who would not consider themselves to be providing supported employment who could fit into that. The Commission supported the SACE review, which was essentially moving away from supported businesses as being a model for the employment of disabled people. And we want to see disabled people far more integrated into the workplace. I think pragmatically there is a problem, though, because there are very few supported businesses in Scotland left, and the goods that they provide are fairly limited. So placing a figure on a requirement to purchase a certain amount could actually just set authorities up to fail. Again, I would prefer to see the emphasis being on the purpose of the contract rather than a figure that we pluck, whether it be about a threshold or a particular proportion of the business that you supply to a particular sector. I think it should be more based on the utility and purpose of the contracts.
In particular regard to disabled people, I know through SCBO run Community Jobs Scotland, and we have a consortium of, you know, over 500 organisations, and at the moment we'll be looking at how do we help young people with long-term conditions get jobs, you know, very focused on disabled people as well. And actually what those jobs will be in regular, if I put mainstream third sector organisations, so they have a real job. So actually it's how we can actually, and you can still use procurement to do this, support that type of organisation who are actually taking on disabled people, people with long-term conditions. It can be done with the right support. You know, organisations in the public and private sector are more than willing to take, you know, people on, but actually, and it takes away from the fact that we're setting up perhaps some supported businesses to fail. Okay,
final question is on the remedies regime. As you know, the bill provides remedies for suppliers, and particularly the new sub-EU threshold procurement spells out the remedies regime, which is very similar to the above threshold regime. Is that necessary, and are the provisions appropriate?
Have a go, Martin?
No, we don't really have a view on that, as I would have to honestly say.
I think you certainly need remedies in place. I haven't that one. I think I'll maybe need to come back to you. I want to give you a view just to rethink it. Certainly, we'll come back to you on that.
Yes, I think that it is important to have remedies, and where it talks about actionable duties and not complying with Section 8, which brings us into the sustainability issue. My concern goes back then again to how we're talking about sustainability and sustainable procurement, and if people are only required to consider economic, social and environmental aspects, it's difficult to see how that's going to flow into ideas of things being actionable, of remedies, unless there's some clarity somewhere about how those three things relate to each other.
Okay. Anyone else? Any members have any further questions that we haven't covered? Gentlemen, any final comments that you haven't managed to get in? No? Okay, well, as with other panels, this has been very useful, very thought-provoking, and given us lots of lines of questioning to the Cabinet Secretary when she comes in. If there's anything you think you've forgotten about, and John, you wanted to come back maybe on something, please do write in to the clerks. But thank you very much for that, and I'll suspend for 5 minutes to allow the witnesses to change over and a comfort break for members. Resume business and on to agenda item 2. The second panel today on procurement. We're going to hear from representatives from the trade unions, including from those trade unions who have submitted public petition PE 1481 on blacklisting. So I now welcome Stephen Boyd, Assistant Secretary from the Scottish Trade Union Congress, Mike Emnott, Employee Relations Advisor at the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, and I hope I've got your name right, and Pat Rafferty from petition PE 1481, a representative of that petition and from Unite, and Dave Watson, Scottish organiser from Unison, Scotland. So, gentlemen, if I could start off again by asking you, to what extent were the trade unions consulted on the provisions in the Procurement Scotland Bill? Dave.
Obviously, we were consulted in the formal sense that we made submissions at every stage of the process. We were also involved in a series of discussions with officials and others in relation to the bill. I can say, we've worked for many years, and one of the advantages I think with procurement is there's been a degree of stability in the officials that have dealt with procurement over the years, which is not something you always find in government departments. I think they always go out their way, I have to say, to try and address issues, even though they are very pushed in terms of time and resource to do so.
Okay. Anyone else? No?
Yeah. Just like to endorse Dave's comments. The STUC has got a very long-standing and constructive working relationship with officials in the Procurement Directorate. As regards specifically the bill, we were involved and represented in all the various working groups that were established around the bill, and have maintained a regular and quite constructive engagement with ministers on it as well. So, yeah, no complaints about the level of engagement.
Okay. So, can I then ask, does the bill deliver the government's policy objectives of, I quote, delivering social and environmental benefits, supporting innovation and promoting public procurement processes and systems which are transparent, streamlined, standardised, proportionate, fair and business friendly? Dave, do you want to start again?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do so, Camina. I think in broad terms, the bill is fine, but our view is that it's too timid in general terms. We think it reflects a risk-averse approach to procurement. It focuses essentially on housekeeping, on tidying up systems, rather than focusing on the wider benefits that we could get from the £9 to £11 billion of procurements there. And that's why we focus on issues like the living wage, on tax dodging and employment standards. Using procurement to address these issues is one way that devolved legislature can tackle those, and that's why, obviously, we're part of the 10 Asks coalition that you've had referred to several times. I think what we'd say is that there is an issue about where you pitch a lot of these things, but the important thing for the bill for us is that it sets out a clear statement of intent. Very often, with people who are involved in procurement and other arrangements, is that if you set out clearly this is what you want to achieve, you can change behaviours, and that's where we see the bill being at its strongest.
Okay, I think we'll come into the specifics that you mentioned later, but anyone else?
If I could just say for CIPD, we're a professional body, we're not a trade union as such, but I suppose you could say we represent the HR community in all its manifestations, from HR managers, academics, students, consultants and so on. I'm afraid I haven't spent as long on the bill itself as I perhaps should have done, but I would just say, looking at some of the documents around it, including the Scottish Government's policy on procurement in relation to blacklisting, I would just want to see a focus. I think the word objectives is important. What are you trying to achieve? And I think in order to protect individuals and improve practice, you probably need a forward-looking focus. And I did think that some of the wording about the nature of the inquiries to be made looked as if it might be more wider than you might need in order to make sensible decisions about procurement for the future. I know that may be a slightly sort of argumentative point, but I'm simply trying to say, what are you trying to achieve? As long as that's clear, I can't think, and I don't speak for business, because CIPD is not a business body, it's a professional body, but I would think that the forward focus and protecting individuals, improving practice, is the right approach.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else?
Just
Stephen and then Pat.
Just to quickly supplement Dave's comments, I think the bill for the STC is slightly disappointing when measured against the early aspirations for what was then described as the sustainable procurement bill that we enjoyed discussions with ministers 18 months, 2 years ago. I mean, at that point we were talking about issues such as economic impact with ministers who at that point seemed quite confident they'd be able to do something really new and different and challenging. I think we were much more circumspect about what might be achieved, but nevertheless the aspirations were set very high, and I don't think the bill really delivers on many of them.
And as I asked before, do you think because it covers such a wide range of organisations in the bill that it is necessary at the bill stage, quite high level, if you like, and that subsequent legislation and regulations maybe address the points you've raised?
I think there's certainly scope for that. I mean, I guess the concern would be on specific issues such as the minimum wage, not the living wage, sorry. Not only is it not mentioned in the body of the bill, none of the supporting documents even mention it, so it seems to have fallen off the agenda. And it would be the concern, I think.
Okay, and Pat?
Just on, as you were saying earlier, convening, I was involved in the petitions committee for the blacklisting that's been touched on by Mike, and I don't know if you're going into more specifics at this particular time, but certainly, you know, the blacklisting and how it addresses blacklisting within would be something that I would like to expand on.
Okay, we certainly will go into more detail on that later on in the question. So, Alex, you've got some questions on the key concept and application of the bill.
Thanks, Convener. First of all, do you think the bill applies to the right set of contracting authorities?
I think, from our perspective, when I read through the bill, the first one that screamed at me was "Where's Scottish Water?" And then I thought about it, and then it clicked to me, of course, that the Scottish Water is unusually in Scotland because it's a public service covered by the Utilities Directive, and so I suspect that's a reason. I think some of the officials have said that in evidence to you before. I understand that answer. However, I would still say Scottish Water should be included. And the reason for that is that the Utilities Directive is fine, but this bill is seeking to establish a number of general and specific duties right across the public sector, and Scottish Water is clearly part of that, and a very big purchaser. And, you know, its capital programme, £500 million a year on that basis, is very important for industry, and therefore I think the specific duty should apply to Scottish Water and other public corporations on the same lines.
Moving on from that then, do you support the introduction of the new regime for below EU threshold contracts, and what are your views on the specific level of the thresholds introduced by the bill?
Dave again.
I think the issue of the thresholds, as you know, there are an enormous variety and across Europe in terms of these areas of thresholds. I think from our perspective, the advantage of having the higher thresholds is obviously, A, it makes it simpler for people to bid because we can have simpler processes, but it also perhaps means that we can have some wider quality considerations that are not as constrained by the European rules if the thresholds are not set at the right level. And also, I think it's a very clear European law provision is that of proportionality, and we can play there. The only wariness I would put in this is that that one of the advantages of having the procurement regime apply is in relation to access to the contract. There's some history that small businesses and some particularly minority groups and others have not always accessed contracts, but haven't been aware of them. Now, you might say, well, that could be balanced by the provision in the bill that says that everything should be published on the public contracts website. small businesses in particular, I know, would say, well, we haven't got the time to be hunting through. It's a very complicated searching exercise to do it with that. I think there may be some risk that purchasers get into relationships and working with a limited group of suppliers, which other suppliers might find difficult to break into. So I think there is a balance to be had. One of the things about thresholds that I don't think has particularly been highlighted is that obviously we're awaiting the new EU directives in this area, and one of those areas is about the thresholds in relation to health and care procurement, where we hope when we see the final directives come through, there might be some flexibility in terms of much higher directives to exclude health and social care, which is also a big issue for us and others. And to be honest, a whole swathe of the problems we have with procurement basically boil down to health and social care in particular. And so that may be an issue, and how we address that could be a factor. The other threshold issue here is, remember, a lot of the community benefit issues relate to the higher threshold, the 4 billion one, and again, that's quite high. I know that, if you look at where procurement goes, if you look at it by value, it looks as if it's big contracts, but actually it's made up of a lot of very small contracts, and so I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. So it is a balance. I don't have an absolute answer on that, but I think if you exclude too many from the process, be wary about access to public sector contracts.
You've talked a lot about balance in that answer, and another thing I wanted to raise was that whether you had an opinion on how the impact of the new thresholds will affect contracting authorities and those bidding for contracts. Do you think the structure of the bill makes it fair between contracting authorities and potential bidders, or is there an advantage to one or the other?
I don't think there is, to be honest. I mean, obviously, we represent most of the procurement staff who do this job in public bodies, and I think there is an issue of balance at the moment. Then judgments have to be made. I think simplicity is fine, but there is a trade-off on simplicity, and that is that are people getting the full access that they would require? There isn't an easy solution. I think the approach of perhaps pitching different types of contracts in different ways is probably the right one, and we have the flexibility in the bill to adjust the thresholds by secondary legislation. I think that's right as well, because one of the advantages of the reporting mechanisms is that we can start to learn a little bit more about how it's applying, and that your legislators might want to say, well, actually, this hasn't worked quite so well. Should we not be changing these particular threshold limits?
But you think the bill has avoided the potential pitfall of making the procurement process simpler for those who are implementing it by making it harder for those who are bidding in?
Well, I have to say, I don't think that view. I was speaking at a conference of procurement professionals the other day, and I have to say that wasn't their view. To be honest, I'm probably not some of our members' most popular trade union official, given that we keep adding to the things that should be done through procurement. Most procurement officials would say, our job used to be about sorting out the technicalities, getting a cheap price, and now we've got all these other things to do. So in fairness, that would be the view of procurement professionals. Sadly, my answer would be, well, life's like that. Essentially, life gets more complicated and the provisions get more complicated. And certainly for procurement officials, they would argue that this doesn't make it necessarily simpler for them. In fact, it requires them to take account of a much wider range of factors.
Would anybody else like to agree or disagree with Dave?
I wouldn't dare disagree with
Move on to part 2, general duties and procurement strategies. Gordon, you've got some questions on that.
Thanks, Convener. What are your views on the proposed sustainable procurement duty?
Yes, I mean, obviously, obviously a participant of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, obviously I largely defer to Tom Ballantyne's earlier evidence on that basis, which we largely agree with. For the reasons I think he outlined, there's not much point in me repeating those. We would largely go along with those views. It's part of the 10 asks, and I think we've tried to give you some very specific views around that issue.
Okay. Anybody else want to come on? No. So, do you see any conflict between the sustainable procurement duty and the general duties to treat suppliers without discrimination and to act in a transparent and proportionate manner, and how might contracting authorities resolve this?
I mean, I think I don't want to tread into the living wage, because I presume you're going to ask us about that later, because there are some very specific issues around discrimination under that issue, and I'll happily explain some of the legal issues as we see it under that heading. I think the problem with general duties is that the value of general duties is they set that statement of intent I was talking about earlier. The difficulty that a lot of our members find in implementing them, and I was having this same discussion with another committee about better regulation, for example, is that sometimes they're struggling to know, well, you know, which of these do we apply, particularly where there's a conflict situation. You know, in regulation terms, do we apply? You know, if you're a meat inspector inspecting animals going down an abattoir line, are you worried more about the diseased animal, or are you worried about the economic impact of stopping the line? You know, if you're a meat inspector, to be honest, that, you know, you just cannot make those judgments. So I think if we are having them, the right approach is to apply them at a higher strategic level, so that these duties apply essentially to the guidance that organisations, public bodies have to apply. What we don't want is confusion for our members at the sharp end when they're doing having to apply these particular duties in individual examples.
So it's ensuring we've got the right policy guidance in place.
That's absolutely, it's guidance, and then that applies to individual procurement rules and policies of individual local authorities, because that's where our members in procurement obviously put a focus.
And my final question is, do you welcome the proposals on procurement strategies and annual reports, and how might these be used to hold contracting authorities to account?
Very much so. I do think that there's value, as long as it doesn't become just a tick box exercise. And to be honest, that's up to us as civil society organisations and yourselves as legislators to pull in people who just do the tick box. But I do think it gives you an opportunity to get a better picture of how these things work in practice and enable us to evaluate the impact of legislation and regulation.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Do you want to come in on this?
Yes, Dave, you said your view was that the legislation is too timid, and in the previous panel we heard from the likes of John Downey, who indicated that he doubted whether behaviour would change on the back of this particular piece of legislation. What's required is an actual cultural, behavioural change, so that the procurement officers, if you like, have the confidence to actually bring consideration of local social impact and the like to bear. What do we need to do to this legislation to effect that change, if you like?
I suppose I'm not quite as cynical as John on this one. My view is that that cultural change takes a number of stages, and I think legislation does have an important effect. Yeah, for example, we argued that with violence at work legislation, for example, by Parliament saying assaulting people at work, in that case emergency workers, was wrong. You then start to introduce the training, the guidance, and it gets out there in the public, and you start to change. If you take, for example, I don't know, drink driving is another good example of that. You know, drink driving. You know, the cultural attitude that that, dare I say, you and I might remember some many years ago, has changed. It didn't just change overnight just because a piece of legislation kicked in there. The legislation was a catalyst for a broader cultural change. So I entirely accept that passing a piece of legislation doesn't make cultural change in itself, but it can be the start of a process which, in a number of years' time, will, I think, deliver some useful change.
Okay.
And then Stephen.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I agree with what Dave said. I think that pressures from outside can fly a flag, contest, if you like, what the rest of the community thinks. You pick up flack or you get support. You're absolutely right, though, that culture change is what's needed to change. I mean, it's almost tautologous to say that you need culture change to change behaviour, because if when you get the behaviour, you've got the culture. The question is, as you said, how do you do it? And I think that I've got two things, really. One is the top of the organisation has to believe in what it's saying. Mm-hmm. By and large, people at the top of the organisation don't get a lot of credibility just for saying it. So they have to find ways of communicating that are believable and believed, so they have got to behave in accordance with what they're saying. Secondly, I think the point that's sort of come up already on procurement, which I'm no kind of expert on, but if you just leave it as a job for the procurement guy to do, then he's either stranded as a kind of, and it becomes box ticking, or where does he go? Or the organisation embraces procurement and takes it on board as a way of, accepts it a bit like legislation or good practice or some kind of standard to be applied. And so it's about leadership, it's about line management training. If it's left to procurement, it could just be a dead letter.
Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is quite an old debate, I think, in many ways. If you look at Eurostat publishes figures for the proportion of procurement spend that's spent domestically. Now, we don't see Scotland as a separate member state, obviously, but the UK always figures right at the very low end of the spectrum in that. We're then told this is because other countries do things differently, but there's been various reviews over the years. I mean, there was that massive Wood review back in 2004, I think, which was absolutely, the whole purpose was to identify what these other countries were doing differently. And you know, if you look at the conclusion of that report, they're very, very weak. They really couldn't identify anything practically that these nations were doing differently. It was all about the whole culture of procurement. And you know, I think going about changing that, I think Dave's made the point very well about legislation. I think training and resources are absolutely vital here as well. I mean, we mentioned the Marrakesh training programme in our submission, and I know from speaking to procurement officials and people in, say, Transport Scotland, who've taken a very different view of the whole procurement process after they've been through this training. And I think, you know, the signal that comes from the top is really, really important here. Again, had some recent discussions with government officials who we had a discussion with a few years ago about what might be achieved in a particular industrial sector in Scotland looking forward and what the role of government might be in that. And they were very positive about the way that government looking forward might send signals to the private sector about forthcoming contracts. Lo and behold, a few years later we've been told again, well, we just couldn't do that under EU law, so you know, if we are going to procure in that area, the contracts won't necessarily be flown out of the country. So you know, we really need to think ahead as well and send very, very strong signals.
I read your submission and I thought, could you explain a bit more what the Marrakesh programme is? I thought that must have been an exotic holiday for something.
Yeah, there's people sitting in the room who could probably do it a lot better than me. I mean, it's a programme that procurement, any officials, and I think it's mainly been delivered to central government procurement officials, but I may well be very wrong in that. But it's just about trying to get the procurement community to look at the whole range of issues that can be included in the procurement process, the kind of things we're discussing today. I'll not embarrass myself by trying to give you any more detail, but I can maybe commit to providing something in paper to the committee at a later stage.
Thank you, or I'll have to look it up myself. But yeah. Okay, Pat, you wanted to come in on this too.
I think the procurement bill also gives an opportunity to try and enforce other guidance that's out there in terms of, you know, living wages and blacklisting, you know, in particular. That we've seen the recent guidance that's came out for the Scottish Government on blacklisting, and certainly welcome that. That's there, and how you deal, how, you know, through procurement the public sector deals with companies that have been involved in blacklisting. So that's a welcome step. But however, guidance is guidance. It's discretionary. It's not enforceable. Whereas the procurement bill gives an opportunity to enforce some of this guidance that's there, in particular, as I say, within the blacklisting. And whilst we've got every confidence that that guidance for blacklisting will be enacted by most of the public bodies, and in particular the local authorities will apply that, it gives them, though, those authorities a strong foothold and a strong message that's there within the procurement bill that allows this to take place. So I think that's something that you need to seriously look at in that perspective.
Okay. That was right. Jim, I think we're on to you.
Right. Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I've got a specific question, if I may, for Mr Watson, on your written submission, which I read with interest, and that's on freedom of information. Your organisation makes a statement: we want to see amendments to the bill to the effect that all companies bidding for public contracts should, as a condition of the contract, have to comply with FOI legislation. as regards that contract. I was just wondering what the intention was behind that. Is it, given that we are in Edinburgh, were you thinking of contracts such as the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, where a lot of information is redacted and not available to the public under FOI on the basis that it is commercial in confidence? Is that the target behind this proposition?
As someone who's spent, it seems, half his life chasing details of that particular contract, right the way through the Commissioner, through the courts and everybody else, then yes, I do have the proverbial scars on that one, and many others. I think the principle for us is that you know, if you want to bid for the public pound, you know, you buy into public values such as openness and transparency. Now, we're not saying very clearly that if you bid for a public contract, if you're, you know, a big construction company that bids for one company, we're not saying you're open to FOI on all your processes. What we are saying, however, are the processes in relation to the contract that you are bidding for, you're open to FOI with all the defences that are there under the current FOI provisions in terms of commercial confidentiality and other arrangements. So the simple principle is, you know, you follow the public pound, you buy into the public value. So yes, PFI contracts obviously are a classic example of that, and we have pursued those, and you know, I've written a book on the subject, highlighting all of those arrangements. But it's more broader than that in terms of, obviously, there are a wide range of public contracts where people are entitled to have that level of transparency. And at Vents, I think the bill is trying to do transparency. I just think the FOI bit's probably been missed off that.
Okay, I just wanted to get that out of the way at the start, so thank you for that clarification. We look forward to the amendments in due course. Can I ask about the community benefit requirements of the bill, and perhaps start off with Mr Boyd. I was reading your submission from STUC where you highlight the fact that the requirement for contracts at 4 million or above to be subject to community benefit clauses wasn't strong enough, and that it referred to, they used the word should rather than must. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, well, first I'm slightly concerned that there's a growing misconception that the bill does stipulate must in these circumstances, and I noticed the Spice briefing actually briefs to that effect. So I mean, I think we have, you know, very important that we get it on record that it's only a should. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, it's just a potentially very useful lever of local economic development. We have in Scotland a sector-led, sector-based economic strategy, which I would argue can work very well for certain parts of the country, but not so much for others. And I think, you know, we need to increasingly focus on what levers we can pull in these other parts of the country that are going to boost local economic development. And this is one of them, if well designed. And we have numerous examples from around Scotland, and the Scottish Government has published very good literature to this effect that I think has been underused. We can learn from these good examples, and we can ensure that public contracts deliver genuine economic benefits that are going to leave a durable impact in these communities. So I would argue absolutely that contracts of that scale should stipulate that community benefits must be used as a minimum.
Is that the right level to set the threshold?
I think, I mean, I don't really have a really compelling view on the level of threshold. It certainly seems high. I mean, I've not seen a justification why contracts half that size, you know, at least should contain community benefits. It seems entirely arbitrary, and I've not seen a decent explanation about why that should be the starting point.
Okay, and the views of other witnesses?
Just quickly, I agree with what Stephen said, but I think 4 million is too high. I understand why it's been picked. They've tried to pick other thresholds, but I do think that you know, they're quite large contracts, and there would be other large contracts for which you would want to lever in that type, particularly local community benefit. If you pitched it a little lower than that, you know, I don't know the precise figure, but I would go as even as low as half of that, and like 2 million, because otherwise you're really only then starting to talk about some very big contracts and not perhaps extracting the community benefit at a local level for contracts that we're talking over that 4 million threshold.
Okay. Mr Rafferty, do you have a view?
Yeah, I've shared. I wouldn't disagree with my colleagues here, Stephen or Dave, on that, to lower on that. It seems quite a a high threshold at 4 million would debar some organisations from participating.
That's great. Just for completeness, Mr. Emmett, have you got... No, okay. Can I ask about workforce issues? Clearly there's an opportunity through the bill and any guidance that's issued in association with it to make workforce-related issues such as the inappropriate use of zero-hour contracts and the often illegal and unacceptable practice of blacklisting a stipulation of when awarding those contracts. I'd be interested to know the views of witnesses, and perhaps it'd be appropriate to kick off with Mr. Rafferty, given the...
No, thanks for that. And I did touch on this just a bit earlier about blacklisting, and whilst we welcome the guidance that's been given out by the Scottish Government on that, then there's clearly an opportunity within the procurement bill to enshrine that guidance within procurement that gives it that impact, or that strong foot in there for local authorities and other public sectors to enforce that, to ensure that the blacklisting companies are dealt with in an appropriate way. There is clearly discussions that's going on at this particular time within the companies themselves that's been found guilty of blacklisting, and trying to get solutions to this and move the issue forward in terms of compensation and how you deal with blacklisted companies, and when they're able again to retender for this type of public sector contracts. There is concerns over the level of compensation that's been muted at this particular time. £1,000, you hear £100,000 being mentioned. There's absolutely no way people will be going about £100,000, more like £1,000. And how you can address that issue. I think that there is an opportunity, because development within the powers that the Scottish Government has, for a Scottish solution to compensation in that sense, to address that going forward. So there's clearly a great opportunity within the procurement bill for blacklisting of the companies to be addressed. You also need to look at how do you, contracts are ongoing, and a company then becomes, seems that the blacklisting becomes an issue, and then how do you deal with that as well? So, as I say, it's a real opportunity for us within the procurement bill to strengthen that scurrilous practice that the companies are clearly being guilty of.
So to be clear, you want to put this on a statutory footing by having it in the...
I think you should have a clause within the procurement bill that clearly addresses how you deal with companies that have been blacklisted, and how you deal with them through that procurement process.
Can I just ask you what discussions you've had with procurement officials at the Scottish Government on this issue? Is that something that you've suggested to them?
We have. I'm not been directly involved. There's a subcommittee that's been formed on that, so our political officer Jackson Cullinan is on that. So I know there has been dialogue, and it's ongoing at this particular time, how you would try and frame that up.
And the advice that you referred to, which I have here, makes specific mention at paragraph 17 that the Scottish Government intends to meet with the STUC and interested trade unions on a quarterly basis initially to review how the guidance is being applied. So is that not an opportunity for you to have a real stake in ensuring that this guidance, assuming that we don't have it included in the bill, but that the guidance actually achieves what it's meant to achieve?
It would be an opportunity. It gives you that forum to discuss it under, but I think it would be certainly more powerful if you see a clause within the procurement bill itself strengthening that guidance that's already came from the Scottish Government.
I mean, is it not covered under Section 23, selection of tenderers, and 24, guidance on selection of tenderers?
I'm not quite sure. I don't know the verbatim what that's saying at this particular time, but I know, that we've certainly in discussions at this particular. I don't think that's strong enough, and there needs to be a particular clause on, more details on that, convener.
Mr. Emnott, I mean, the blacklisting is, it's been looked at in terms of the tenderers, but as a former HR professional and indeed a member of your institute, you know, isn't blacklisting, in my view, it is sloppy HR practice. Have you got a comment on that, and how would you approach it and your organisation approach it?
I think you've put your finger on an important element of it. I wouldn't have led with it myself, but sloppiness, I think, is probably at the heart of some of the real problems that's occurred. My CEO, Peter Cheese, gave evidence to the Scottish Affairs Select Committee back in September and made clear that we totally condemn blacklisting. As you may know, some of our members are currently being looked at under our Code of Ethics, Code of Practice as HR people, to see whether they should suffer some kind of penalty, and that investigation will presumably continue for a little time, because, as you know, the legal proceedings in London relating to blacklisting are just getting underway at the moment, and the timescales look quite long. But just to say, as it were, declaring an interest, some of our members have names have been brought up in this context. Peter Cheese has said we totally condemn it. And just to add, we are publishing next week a guide on pre-employment checks. Sounds a bit technical. It isn't specifically focusing on blacklisting, but it does raise the issue of whether any form of blacklisting is ever okay. It also looks at the impact of social media, whether employers are allowed to go online, skate around, look for things to find fault with, and it talks also about supply chain, use of contractors and use of employment agencies or people to carry out checks. So what I think we're trying to do is demonstrate that we are trying to draw a line under blacklisting as far as our position is concerned, and say, how can people keep out of trouble in future? And that just brings a general point, if I may make it, on blacklisting. It's not just on blacklisting, but following on from blacklisting, I'm quite happy to talk about zero-hours contracts, on which we've done quite a bit of work.
Just before you go on to that,
yeah.
is there a conflict between what's in here, the tenderers, and employment law, which is obviously still a reserved issue at the moment?
I think that there's a layer which you're looking to place around the law. I think that always occurs. I suspect it does. As I say, I'm not a procurement guy, but if you accept it in relation to equal opportunities and diversity, I cannot see that you suddenly decide that you can't have anything other than the law. There's quite a growth in soft law, as you probably know, not desperately in the UK, although the European Commission thinks it's moving a bit into more softer approaches where you don't lay down strict rules about everything, and at global level you've got quite a lot of soft law around international framework and so on. So I don't have a problem with the fact that there is a law and you're also looking to impose on, as a superstructure if you like, on that, a procurement dimension. But it does, I think there is the scope for, I think longer term there is the scope for confusion as to what exactly people expect and what society expects. It normally goes for legislation. Legislation isn't popular, and in your case it may be, it's a reserved right, so it's not an immediate option. I think you can argue that using procurement means you can involve a wider range of attitudes. You can look at ethical issues or soft issues, you can look at good practice. But I think the point I wanted to make was this, that that gives a lot of discretion to the people making the decisions. And it could be quite tough work, actually, deciding what it means. Just because something's not good practice doesn't mean it's execrable or an awful thing to do. Good practice is a wide range of stuff. I think blacklisting is very clear because you've got several bits of legislation that can bear on it, including data protection, where there are massive penalties. But I think that if you're going to allow and encourage and use discretion, it's probably a good idea to produce codes or some kind of guidelines so that people know against what standard they're being judged. I know this is just simply reintroducing the question of how does it relate to legislation, and I can't really answer that properly. I think it's a sort of philosophical question. I think perhaps I struggle with, but it's worth a go. But as I say, we've produced a code on pre-employment checks, and I hope that might be useful to some of the people involved in blacklisting. Similarly, on 0 hours, we're talking about codes. We've produced some material which I'm happy to send your Secretariat last week, which I think is a fairly balanced view about 0 hours contracts. I'll leave it there. Sorry to take time.
That's okay. Dave?
Just briefly on blacklisting, I am a member of the group that Pat referred to, and I think we did welcome the Scottish Government's initiative there, and did take that forward, in advance of the bill. Of course, in our view, it doesn't ever go quite far enough, but that's probably our view on most things. And we will obviously be doing the review to see if it does. But I do think what it does do is send out the sort of behavioural messages that we sent out before, and I think that's also important in some of the wider workforce issues. 0 hours contracts, and we would include nominal hour contracts. By that I mean people who have a contract, say, for 10 hours but regularly work 15 or 20. I think, people will always say, well, there are some people who want them, and yes, there are in some areas, but that's not the norm, particularly in areas like care. I think we need to be clear that in those circumstances, 0 hours contracts has some very unfortunate impacts that we may not always be obvious. And interestingly, some of them are rather similar to blacklisting. I was doing a focus group the other day with a group of care workers, and I said to them, those who are on 0 or nominal hour contracts, I said, well, would you raise health and safety issues with your employer? And they said, we're on the 0 hour contract. We raise health and safety issues. We won't be asked back, which is exactly the position that colleagues were in on blacklisting. Sadly, I also then asked the question, well, what if you saw care abuse? And they said, well, we'd be pretty reluctant to raise that as well, to be honest, for the same reason. People who raise difficult questions don't get asked back in 0 or nominal hour contracts, and people are very concerned about that. And another workforce issue, which is very clear you can do under the legislation, and Kavita, you raised it yourself, was issue of training. And again, we don't specify in enough detail the level of training, particularly in the care field. I mean, frankly, there are lots of people who are being recruited into the care field, who are being sent out to deal with very complex care conditions with only a day or two's training. And that just is not acceptable. And frankly, care is a national disgrace in the way we procure it. And we really have got to get a grip of that, and procurement is the way that we do that.
Okay, thanks. And we have got evidence coming from the Health and Sport Committee on this as well. Mr. Emnett, you wanted to come back in.
Just to say that whistleblowing is probably a sort of consensus answer to the question of how you stop employers mistreating people who simply want to draw attention to bad practice. And I know in the NHS the whole issue's been under continuous review for quite a long time, and there's just a recent whistleblowing commission report as well, which I think its main weakness is it treats it as a legal issue rather than a cultural issue, but that's another point.
Yeah. Jim, did you want
just
to come back
on the back of Mr Watson's powerful contribution on the care sector, is there scope, given what you've just said about the reluctance of care workers to come forward and report on abuse or lack of compliance with health and safety? We have a national health service whistleblowers helpline. Is that something that we should be thinking about in terms of the care sector?
It is. Obviously, that has a particular grouping, doesn't affect the more broader groups. There is a petition in the Petitions Committee at the moment, for example, looking at local government whistleblowing. There's a separate issue raised in relation to the health service. It's complex. We just provided a submission to that last week, in which we've highlighted, as Mike says, the recent report of the Whistleblowing Commission, which does set out in some considerable detail. Lord Leveson, I think it was, wasn't it, who chaired OHAD, is probably more famous for other matters, but that report does set out a lot of very interesting procedures, and we generally welcome that, and we think that could be used in local government and the health service to strengthen whistleblowing provisions. There are problems because the statute is a very weak one, and frankly has been watered down by the UK government very recently, only this year in fact. So there are problems sometimes between the disconnect between the statutory provision and the practice, and as trade unions we have to advise members that if they do something out with the current UK law, they are not always protected from unfair dismissal, and that's a problem in legal advice that we give. Again, we set this out in slightly more detail to the Petition Committee, but I would point you to the Whistleblowing Commission report, only came out last week, with a very good analysis of this issue.
I'm not sure this is directly related to the procurement bill. Pat, if it's not directly related to the bill and just on whistleblowing, I'm not going to let...
Just briefly on some of the points, particularly on the 0 hours contract and the bogus self-employed, because it is quite widespread that, and you know, and Dave raises the one within the care sector, which is, you know, for all the right reasons, but we see it in other sectors, and it's quite, as I say, widespread. But we've seen, for example, you know, the offshore sector, where we have bogus self-employed people, whistleblowing. It's all fine and good and well to say there's whistleblowing there. Getting people to step up to the plate and whistleblow is very, very hard indeed. We've seen the Super Puma disasters offshore, and we found out that some of the survivors in that were actually bogus self-employed, and employers were ready to cut their income. These people have been through the trauma they've been through to find that they were then worrying about mortgages and, you know, how they're going to pay their rent and how they're going to feed their family. You know, so, you know, the living wage, 0 hours contracts, bogus employed have an impact on the economy. Because people on 0 hours contracts who try and go to their bank and say to them, I'd like to go on the property ladder to buy my first time house, ain't going to get that mortgage because there's no guaranteed income effectively with 0 hours contracts. And so it has an effect on the economy and how, you know, people try and progress. So there's opportunities within the procurement bill to try and address some of these things that as a benefit to the economy in general.
I think, having worked in the offshore industry, you know, people think going as a consultant on a 0 hours contract is good because they look at the top line, but they forget all the responsibilities that come with that, and that's certainly not spelt out by the companies that employ consultants or folk on 0 hours contracts. Jim, are you done? Good. Okay, thanks. We now move on to Mark.
Thank you, Convener. We spoke about workforce issues, but we haven't really focused on the living wage yet. Just to ask if members of the panel are content with what the government have said about the living wage, whether they agree with the government's legal position that it can't be placed on the face of the bill, and that they intend to use guidance to encourage employers to pay the living wage.
I don't suppose it'll... I think, first of all, we should say that I think the Scottish Government's done a lot of very good things on living wage. Both we in Scotland have the highest proportion, particularly in the public sector, on living wage. We also welcome the commitment on accreditation, because we think that helps to drive good practice on that basis. The gap, frankly, is in procurement. If we're going to extend the living wage into the wider community, particularly into the private sector, then procurement is one of the ways of doing that. And I won't reiterate the obvious case for doing that, not just for employers and for workers, but also the economic case to do that. Unison published a report a couple of weeks ago during Living Wage Week by Lambert Economics, which showed actually you could generate jobs and benefits to the local economy by doing living wage through procurement. The legal issue in relation to this particular issue is that essentially there was this letter that was written by the then Cabinet Secretary and the reply. Frankly, I wouldn't have written the letter. And frankly, if you write letters to the European Commission, you do have the risk of getting the wrong answer. Frankly, we already had a perfectly adequate answer from the Commission to a parliamentary question in 2009, which very clearly set out the legal position. It was in relation to the London question raised by an MEP in relation to London, but the same principle applied. And essentially the key legal issue is that for living wage to be lawful in procurement, it has to be linked to the performance of the contract. So essentially, the legal issues, the first legal issue is that it mustn't be discriminatory. That's an overwhelming point. And secondly, it must be specified in the contract. This is what we sometimes call the level playing field argument. And as John Downey was saying earlier this morning, that's the main concern when we deal with contractors. They say to us, look, Dave, tell us what the rules are. If we're bidding on a level playing field, that's fine. And they're concerned about it being treated in the evaluation stages. They don't know what they're bidding on. You know, if they've been told it's living wage, fine, we're competing on something else other than wage rates. And that's where the benefit comes. The third legal issue in relation to that is that it must only involve staff who are involved in the contract. So you can't say, again, to a big private company that's bidding for this contract, yes, that contract must be on the living wage. You can't then say all the rest of your jobs must be on the living wage. You might persuade them that's a good idea, but you can't enforce that on that basis. Now, that's my summary noddy guide on the legal point. If you want the 14-page explanation, we did submit evidence with a council opinion, a 14-page council opinion to the Local Governments Committee inquiry on the living wage, which council has set out in some detail how we deal with those particular issues. Essentially, today, and I think everyone agrees, even the procurement guidance, it boils down to a potential challenge under the Posted Workers Directive. Now, you know, think about this. The Posted Workers Directive essentially is a European piece of law where a company, presumably from a low-wage economy in Eastern Europe, is going to post workers to Scotland to deliver a particular public service contract. Now, you could imagine in a high-level, high-wage area, some of Pat's people offshore, for example, some of those areas where a company might want to do that because they're going to bring workers over, they'll accommodate them, etc. Can you really see this happening for a cleaning or a hospitality contract where the difference in wages is between the national minimum wage and the living wage? Is that profit margin enough to pay for the accommodation of hundreds of Polish or Romanian or Bulgarian cleaners or hospitality workers? Clearly it isn't. And this is the reason that there haven't been challenges to, with the exception of Alex Johnson, of course, who I always put on my slides on climate change. The only other Conservative politician probably appears on my slides is Boris Johnson. Frankly, Boris Johnson has said many times, as to his staff, I was at the Living Wage Foundation in London representing Scotland the other week, frankly, you've got to take a view about legal challenges. If you ask lawyers, and I am one, if you ask me what the legal position is, I will give you the legal position. The right question to ask me is, I want to do this. Dave, tell me how I can legally do it. And we've told you how to do it. In 14 pages of council opinion, we've told you very clearly how you do it. And the Posted Workers Directive, frankly, bring it on if there's an issue of a legal challenge there. It's not going to happen, not in a living wage area. It might be an issue in a high wage contract on that basis, but then the living wage won't apply in those circumstances. They're paid well above that. So there are theoretical legal challenges, which council shows you if you really want to bottom that off, a small amendment to this bill will do that. But frankly, the chances of a legal challenge are absolutely minimal. And this is the key issue. And our real concern is that, it's no good saying, oh, well, we'll encourage people. There's nothing, as Stephen said earlier in the financial memorandum, about it. And it's the care area again. This is the area where the issue boils down to. That you specify the living wage. In most public procurement areas, that's the area where we need the resources and we need this legislation to plug the gap. And in the care field, that means that you could have a situation where you get the continuity of employment because people do not treat care as a new retail. They essentially want to stay. There's continuity of care in into this particular field, and then you couple that with the contracts and the training issues I raised earlier, and you then start to create a quality provision in a field like care by using procurement in the appropriate way.
Briefly, living wage has got traction and it's become popular because employers have chosen, not necessarily without any encouragement, but they have opted to pay a living wage because they think it pays off for them, often in terms of reputation, and because they can afford it. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. So you've got that issue, really, of affordability, and I think, well, I say you've got it. I think you'd have to be careful. especially bearing in mind, as Dave said, there's a minimum wage, and there is a question longer term, you know, how many separate floors do you want to run under wages, and what's the justification? But I do think that it's worth keeping employers on side, as they have been so far, and as I think the proponents of a living wage, the Living Wage Foundation, tend to see it as something to be done by people who can see the value, rather than something pushed down their throat.
Pat?
I think that, you know, Dave makes the great point about be careful of the question you ask and how you ask it, because you'll get the response that you'll get. But the living wage and trying to get that living wage beyond public sector and the private sector is absolutely key, because the other factor in this is about the unlevel playing field that it can create for within the public services itself, who are trying to keep services in-house or tendering themselves within that, who are paying the living wage. And you have a private sector employer out there who's paying minimum wage, coming in and undercutting that, and you know, and it ends up getting outsourced, and the quality service goes. You know, all these arguments that are there. So to create that level playing field and make it a level playing field for the whole tendering process, including the public services, then you need to broaden it, and you need to make sure that, you know, these contracts are stipulated within that you will pay the living wage.
Hey. Fine, thanks. Mary, if we move on briefly and quickly to...
I wanted to ask a couple of questions around climate change. Section 3 of the bill contains an amendment around the use of recycled and recyclable products, and I'd be interested in the panel's view on that. And the other thing I would like to ask is around the climate change duties, and how useful they are in helping to meet our climate change targets, and their lack of mention in the bill. So that's the two things I would like to ask.
2 points. Firstly, on the issue of the recycling, we think that's a very good provision, and as I think Tom Banzai said earlier, is a model perhaps that we can extend more widely in terms of driving that type of good practice. Very often with procurements, be it procurement staff or the wider group of staff are involved in procurement, essentially what they're often screaming out for is good guidance and good support, good ideas, and legislation and guidance, and obviously the professional networks all help to do that, and this is a very good example of that. In terms of the climate change duties, I think perhaps the only thing I would add to what Tom said to you earlier, it was in relation to the current public sector duties which are in the climate change. We feel that perhaps they aren't strong enough. I was a member of the group that drew up the guidance on that area, and our concern has been, and I think it's, if you look at some of the recent reports, for example, issues like the transport strategy, where we don't seem to have got it right in the public sector. We warned that this probably would happen, because what's happening with a lot of these duties is that it's reliant too much on top-down heroic leadership models. In other words, if you read the guidance, it's chief executives will get together and they'll tell everybody else what to do. We argued that actually you need to build this cultural change from the bottom up. So particularly with climate change, there's some great initiatives in areas. South Lancashire Council, for example, did work with the Scottish Government's Climate Change Fund about developing ideas around climate change in the public sector from the bottom up, using workers. And the beauty of that is that not only did it create savings and benefits in the public sector, but people took it out into their communities as well as a spin-off from that. So my only point would be that I think that procurement can help in this area, but we really need to get the public sector duty right, so we make it more inclusive and try and drive some change from the bottom up.
I absolutely endorse Dave's comments. Just like to open it out a wee bit more, and I think it goes back to the word Dave used right at the start. It's an issue of timidity again. I just think there's so much more that can be done through the procurement agenda to support shift towards a more sustainable economy. And I think in this we kind of veer into the innovation territory, and we need to start thinking about procurement in the context of the demand side of innovation policy. We've pretty much look at innovation policy exclusively from the supply side. It's one of skills, it's one of finance, etc. But you know, public procurement is of a scale that it can create and sustain new markets. We can, through forward procurement, provoke the private sector to come forward with goods and services that otherwise they wouldn't have done. And I think it's probably not necessarily a legislative matter. You know, there may be things we can do through legislation. I've not really thought about that too clearly, but I think the wider procurement agenda really has to open up and start thinking about these issues much more clearly than we've done today.
And Adam, would you like to wash up, as they say?
Okay, fine. One specific question regarding the remedies regime. Do you think the introduction of a remedies regime for the sub-EU threshold procurement is necessary, and are the provisions appropriate?
Astonishing. I don't have a particular view on that one. I know it's sort of absolutely gobsmacked all my colleagues and yourselves, but no, clearly it has to be a remedies regime, and I don't have a strong view on whether we've got the right balance in terms of the scale.
Okay. Final question then is on just ask, you've already gone through some areas where you're looking for the bill to be beefed up. Are there any other improvements that you'd like to see within the bill?
The one I think I'd like to highlight is the issue of tax dodging. There is a provision, as you know, in section 23B of the bill, which talks about the obligation to pay tax. You know, clearly that would be possible to deal with companies who have been convicted of tax evasion, but there is also the question of aggressive tax avoidance, and you know, you'll be familiar with the particular issue, and it seems to us that companies that are gaining the taxpayer's pound ought to pay taxes themselves. This doesn't seem to be unreasonable, and I think you'll find among your constituents probably 100% agreement to that view. The question is how we achieve it, and I'm not convinced. I have to say, firstly, I think the issue is how far that section 23B and which contracts it will apply to, because there's a question about whether it will apply to EU regulated procurement, which is obviously the big stuff. And frankly, these are not the small companies, are not the tax dodgers. It's the big companies who can do transfer pricing and other techniques abroad. So I do think we need to look at that one. You know, there are experts greater than me who have looked at this area, and in England they've used a thing called the Social Value Act, which is something that they've used provisions there, which I think we might look to incorporate some elements of that in our legislation, in other words, to give local authorities, because public bodies right across Europe are now doing this, from France, in Helsinki, in Norway, in Sweden, and other countries who are using that, and they're not being challenged or under EU rules for doing it. So I think it's a big issue for us, and it really boils down actually to a point that the convener made about the concern around devolved and reserved legislation. I don't wish you ought to be too worried about that. This Parliament has shown great imagination over the years in doing things it wants to do, even though it might not appear to have the legislative powers to do it, because we've used the powers we've got to achieve the same end. You know, you can think of alcohol pricing. Right, we might want to have dealt with the tax issue on alcohol. We couldn't do that because it was reserved, so we found another way of tackling the issue. Violence at work was another one. We made the criminal law rather than dealing with employment law. All I'm saying is the reason that we've bombarded you with our 10 asks is because what we're saying is procurement law is devolved, so let's use procurement to tackle some of the things that, frankly, we doubt the current UK government is likely to do much about. And there is some movement at the UK level on tax dodging, but frankly, it's very, very weak. It's a general avoidance, which all the experts say 99% of tax avoidance will not be covered by this new provision, and that was last week's announcement. So I would urge you to read what we said, and I'm sure you will, in terms of our evidence on that point, because civil society really does believe that that's an important principle you would want to have something to say about.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
maybe just take the opportunity to stress a couple of things in our written submission that haven't been spoken about up until now. I listened with interest to the colleague in the previous panel who was talking about supported workplaces and the contribution that his organisation made to the SACE review, etc. I'd just like to emphasise that the Quality and Human Rights Commission were not speaking for the workforce in supported workplaces when they contributed to that particular review. The workforce are extremely sceptical, to put it mildly, that they will be mainstreamed into workplaces throughout the economy on similar terms and conditions and supported in their employment in the way they are in their current workplaces. So I think anything that can be done through the bill, would be mentioned a couple of things in the written submission that can help supported workplaces in Scotland would be appreciated. It's a very minimum. We have to start gathering decent information on public contracts that are currently going to supported workplaces. Despite the good work that's been done in that area, we can't answer that question at this moment in time. On equality, again, we mentioned in our written submission that, for instance, we could force suppliers over a certain threshold to demonstrate that they've undertaken a recent equal pay audit in their company. Now, this would help support the range of work that we're currently taking forward with the Scottish Government on women in the workforce, and I think that would be very much to be appreciated. Just lastly, just to reiterate the points I've made about innovation. I mean, I don't think innovation is dealt with particularly well in the bill. I'm not convinced it's a legislative matter at all, but I think in considering the bill, we really have to start thinking about the demand side of innovation policy. Huge opportunity in Scotland here to be doing something really different and world-leading, and I think just a big national task force, I think, to look about how all the different parts of the public sector can work together with the private sector to really produce a bit of step change in policy here.
Okay, anyone else got any members got any further questions? Anyone else got any final comments? Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. That's been most helpful, and we certainly will take all your comments on board. Can I briefly suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to switch over? We can move swiftly on to agenda item 3, on Scottish Housing Regulator's annual report and accounts. The third item is to take evidence from the Scottish Housing Regulator on the annual report and accounts. So can I welcome Kay Blair, Chair of the Scottish Housing Regulator, and Michael Cameron, Chief Executive of that organisation. Kay, would you like to give a brief opening statement?
Yes, indeed, and I will keep it short in the interest of time, but obviously I would like to give you lots of opportunity to ask questions of us. Thank you very much indeed for your invitation to present our first annual report. as an independent regulator. Some of you may recall that we did present to this committee last June, but perhaps it would be helpful if I just very briefly articulated what our key objective is and the work that we have done over the year in question. We are, as you know, the independent regulator of social landlords in Scotland. We're, of course, directly accountable to Scottish Parliament. It was very helpful that in the Housing Bill you gave us one single statutory objective. I wouldn't say it makes our life easy, but it's given us a key focus, and that statutory objective is to protect the interests of tenants and to protect the interests of all those who use the services of social housing in Scotland. So in terms of what we do, we monitor, assess and report regularly on social landlords' performance of housing activities. And in terms of registered social landlords, we address financial well-being and standards of governance. We have a very important and serious role given the number of people that rely on us as an effective, independent and efficient regulator. If I could just perhaps describe the scope of our activities. We regulate around 600,000 tenants and their families, around 40,000 people who may be homeless and who are seeking help in terms of finding a decent, safe and secure home. We regulate to protect around 100,000 people who receive factoring services from their landlords, and of course, very importantly, around 500 Gypsy and Traveller families who use the services of the local authorities, 32 official sites provided by social landlords. So a wide scope, very important role, and we have described it in full in the annual report, which we are discussing today. I won't go through that in detail, but perhaps I could just highlight some of our key outcomes. And obviously the outcome of our work over the last year in question was very much linked to our key priorities as a regulator. These priorities being the financial health of social landlords in Scotland, being good governance of social landlords in Scotland, and being effective service delivery. So what's the quality of services that's actually being delivered on the ground to tenants and others? In terms of the areas, we obviously talk in the annual report about our regulatory activities, our criteria for how we assess RSLs in Scotland and local authorities, looking at those in a bit more depth where we have a more intensive engagement. We describe our preparatory work for the Charter. This is very important. It will start in operation next April will be the first full year of operation, so we've been very busy in terms of engaging with the sector, ensuring that the indicators are the most meaningful and that we have good engagement there. We also are very keen in terms of our key priority in engaging with tenants and others. We have a very comprehensive engagement strategy, and part of that which we highlighted to this committee last year was our national tenant panel and others. We're very keen that we engage with very diverse communities in Scotland, that we reach some of the more hard to reach groups, but in terms of our objective, it's very clear that we should do this, and so we have set up a tenant panel, and I'm delighted to take any questions about that. I think that's probably enough from me at this stage. I'm sure you have lots of questions to ask us, so I'll hand back to you.
We have, so we'll try and rattle through them. First of all, you published a framework for monitoring how landlords meet the requirements of the Social Housing Charter. Can you explain what the framework covers?
Yes, indeed. It covers various criteria that we use in terms of looking at areas of financial strength, how they're meeting Scottish housing quality standards, what they're doing in terms of ensuring that they have sufficient financial headroom to meet some of the particular risks that they face in the sector. So we have a very clear framework against which we monitor performance. I think, and Michael will be able to talk in more detail, there are around 8 specific criteria.
In terms of the Charter in particular, we have consulted on and published a range of indicators that we will use, as Kay's mentioned, from the start of the next financial year to assess landlords' performance in relation to their achievement of the standards and outcomes that are set out in the Scottish Government's Charter. We have set in place 37 indicators in total that landlords will report to us each year. We will then use that information to produce a report on each landlord for their tenants, which we will publish and require landlords to disseminate to all of their tenants, and that will be an annual report. We'll also provide tenants with access to online tools that will enable them to manipulate that data in a user-friendly way that will allow them to compare their landlord's performance with the performance of other social landlords, thereby giving them tools to enable them to have conversations with their landlord about that landlord's performance.
Okay, thanks. Alex?
Thanks very much, Convener. I wondered if you could, while we're on that subject, if you could give us some indication of the timescale involved in reporting on the Charter for both the landlords and the regulator itself.
We will start collecting data after the first full year of operations, so it starts in April 2014, and we will be in a position to report in...
We'd be aiming to have those tenant reports available in probably about August of 2014.
So what benefits do you see the Charter bringing to tenants, for example?
I think there are very clear benefits in not only giving them information about their own individual landlord's performance, but also being able to put it in a context which enables them to compare their particular landlord's performance against other comparable landlords in the sector. And that will be really valuable information in terms of enabling tenants and others to hold their landlord to account, to ask them questions about perhaps the speed of repairs, looking at how they manage voids in terms of their housing stock, looking, for instance, at rent and the levels of rent that are charged. So I think lots of really interesting information about satisfaction levels, value for money, etc.
Did you manage to engage tenants in the process of setting up the monitoring framework and the ongoing reporting of the framework?
Very much. We're very conscious that we should involve a range of stakeholders, not just tenants, but obviously some of the other people who use the services of social landlords. So we spent probably about 12 months in terms of engaging with all these different people and touring the country. It's very important that we don't expect everybody to come to us. So we went out, we spoke to, I think, about 750 organisations. It seems a large number, but a number of them are tenant organisations. We spoke to individuals as well. We encouraged dialogue with us directly through other means because, as I say, it's very important that this is something that works for tenants and others, that tenants and others think our criteria and the indicators are the most important, and that they can then use that information when they get it. It was also very important that we spoke in plain language, and we made sure that we as far as we can, that language is accessible and well understood. So very important. Yes, we did.
Which we very much look forward to having access to these reports when they're available.
Yes.
But they're a little bit away yet. I wondered if you could comment at this stage more generally on the current performance of social landlords in terms of their housing management functions and duties.
I pick up on that particular point. We're a risk-based and proportionate regulator, and that means that our primary focus is looking at the risks to the interests of tenants and others who use the services of social landlords. So on an annual basis, we assess the risks for each landlord, and we develop our engagement strategies for each individual landlord in response to those risks. Within that, we will consider, as things stand, a limited range of performance-related information that we receive currently for RSLs only. When the Charter comes in and we're receiving the full range of indicators, the 37 indicators that I mentioned earlier, we'll have a far richer source of information that will enable us to incorporate far more fundamentally into that risk assessment the performance of social landlords. So at the moment our assessment is looking at the risks rather than necessarily looking at the performance. Where we have a concern about performance in terms of service quality, we'll reflect that in the engagement we have with the landlord, and we will publish what that engagement will be. We do that for registered social landlords through our regulation plans, and for councils we do that in collaboration with our scrutiny partners through the joint scrutiny framework that operates for local authorities.
So the work that you're currently about to undertake and we'll see published later next year will give you a broader picture of what's happening.
That's absolutely the case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, if we move on to the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, Mary.
Convener, earlier this year you published an analysis of social landlords' progress towards achieving the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, and 10 RSLs and 1 local authority were identified as being at risk of not achieving that standard by 2015. Why is that, and what is being put in place to ensure that they meet the standard?
There's a range of factors that contribute to that, and some of them are individual to the particular landlords. Some of it is to do with the quality of the stock that they have. Some of it's to do with historical investment strategies that have perhaps not set the landlord well to respond to the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. Some of it's to do with the reality that some landlords don't have access to the national grid in terms of gas, and energy efficiency is often one area where landlords have particular challenges in meeting the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. So there's a range of factors that contribute to that position. We're aware of the 11 that have identified that they are at risk of achieving the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. We have regulation plans in place with the 10 registered social landlords that are within that group, and we have an insurance improvement plan in place with the 1 local authority. And that's about engaging with them to ensure that we get adequate assurance from those landlords that they are taking action, appropriate remedial action, to enable them to work towards that, and we'll continue to monitor their performance in that all the way up until 2015.
So in 2015, what will happen then if they haven't met the standard?
Well, if they haven't met the standard, then obviously we'd have to understand the reasons, the level of non-achievement of the standard. And bear in mind, these landlords aren't saying that they're not meeting the standard for any of their houses. It may be that it's an ever-diminishing group of houses that are outstanding, and we would put in place an appropriate regulatory strategy to deal with the particular circumstances of that landlord. So it's difficult at this stage to say we would do X, Y or Z. It will very much be tailored to the individual circumstances and the nature of those SHQS failures.
Thank you.
Okay, if we move on to homelessness, can you explain in a bit more detail how you will be monitoring the quality of temporary accommodation that homelessness households are placed in?
This is something that obviously does fall within our radar, and as we speak, we are conducting a research survey to find out more information about homelessness, about the housing options that are available. We will report in January when we have more information, and then we will also report about what we are intending to do about it. But it is something that we're very conscious of, and the board is meeting in early January to look at the findings of this up-to-date report.
I mean, councils must know that they've got a severe problem there in many areas. Have you had any indication of how they intend to tackle it?
There's a fair bit of working on with local authorities and indeed with RSLs in terms of working in partnership to try and address the challenges that there are around having an adequate supply of appropriate temporary accommodation. I think one of the risks is that any rush to try and meet what is undoubtedly a supply-side challenge runs a risk of putting in place inappropriate responses to temporary accommodation. So I think it's about local authorities and RSLs working together to build up the supply of good quality temporary accommodation. And we will have a particular eye to ensuring that we understand how accessible good quality accommodation is, and we'll engage with any local authority where we're seeing risks of people who are experiencing homelessness not getting access to appropriate temporary accommodation.
Okay, and you'll know that we conducted our own homelessness inquiry and as to whether the 2012 targets were being met, but have you any evidence to date of how that target is impacting on the delivery of local authorities and their partners' homelessness services?
This is something that we're looking at, and we will have more information on in January, because we're very keen that we get up-to-date information on the impact. Would it be helpful if, once we have more information, we come back in writing to this committee? Yes, and I think we may even consider, if we've got time, to question you on it as well. So you're doing this study, and obviously you've said that findings will become available in January. Can I mention specifically an article in the weekend which said that Shelter, where I quote, frustrated by the failure of the SHR to step in and protect the rights of homeless people in the city, of which they meant Glasgow. Have you got any comment to make on that? I would like to speak to Shelter directly to hear more about this, because I wasn't made aware before this article appeared that there was a concern in particular about this, so I think it would be premature of me to give an answer when I haven't spoken to them in more detail to get more evidence about this. Okay.
Perhaps worth saying that we have an ongoing engagement with Glasgow City Council in relation to its homelessness service, and indeed we were aware of the difficulties that the council was having, and it's also worth being clear that the council itself has acknowledged those difficulties. So we are engaging with the council at the moment on this matter. We've already published that engagement through the Assurance and Improvement Plan. And we will be looking for the Council to provide us with appropriate assurances that it is in a position to tackle these difficulties both in the short and in the longer term.
Why do you think Glasgow specifically has these problems?
I think Glasgow, again, there's a range of challenges in Glasgow. I think it's often an area that people will gravitate to in terms of those who may be experiencing housing difficulties in the wider hinterland of the city. I think there's also challenges in that the City Council itself does not have its own housing stock, and therefore it's relying on its partners to help it meet its statutory duties. It's also in the process of quite significant change around the renewal of hostels within the city. So there's a lot happening that means that I think Glasgow City Council has its challenges. What we want to understand is how it's responding to those challenges, and particularly to ensure that it is in a position to discharge its duties to anyone who finds themselves to be homeless.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in at the back of that? No? Mark.
Thank you, Convener. It's just a question around about the financial health of social landlords, and I wonder if you could give an update on the financial challenges that which social landlords are facing as a result of economic circumstances and the impact of welfare reform.
I think that's a very pertinent question. We have described some of the risks that we think are present in the sector as we speak. These risks are very much around a different lending climate. Lending is becoming much more challenging for the sector as a whole in terms of the level of their borrowing costs. I think pension liabilities are another issue in terms of pension deficits and how these are going to be funded, and how they're also going to be reported in accounts in future, and what impact that might have on lenders' propensity to lend. I think the impact of welfare reform is undoubtedly another risk which we are exploring at the moment. So I think there are a number of risks that are challenging for registered social landlords. Having said that, I think we would certainly say that the performance of the sector to date has been strong, with a few exceptions. But I think we are very keen as a regulator to ensure that that strong performance continues and that the outcomes for tenants continue to be good. But it would not be it would be remiss of me not to highlight that risks are escalating in the sector, and they are proving challenging, and we are very keen because of that to make sure that tenants get a good deal, that landlords are being run well, that they're being effectively managed, and it's very important that in our regulatory assessments we take account of financial health. I would also say that very closely linked to that is effective governance in the sector, and it's one of our key priorities to make sure that that social landlords are well governed, that their boards are equipped to ask the right questions with the right skills and expertise around these boards, to ensure that they understand the economic challenges, that they meet tenants' needs effectively. So I think allied to financial health, I would also highlight to you effective governance as one of our key priorities.
Thanks for that. Focusing on tightening of lending criteria and increased borrowing costs, do you think those costs are justified, given that social landlords have reported that surpluses and turnover have grown, and that the number of registered social landlords recording a deficit is at a 5-year low? Do you think those increased costs are justified?
I think it's up to individual landlords to negotiate individual deals with each social landlord. So I'm not sure I would give a generic answer to that one. In terms of the reserves that social landlords have, I think that it's very important from our point of view that they have sufficient financial headroom so that they are able to weather some of the risks that are out there in the sector. So we as a regulator do not have a remit to regulate the sector as a whole. It's each individual landlord. Michael, do you want to say anything else on that one?
No, I think just to echo that very point, that when we consider the financial health of an individual landlord, we're looking at that landlord. We don't take a systemic view or a sectoral view of financial health. The message that we've put out, and we put out this very recently in a regulatory advisory note that we issued to the sector, that it's incumbent upon them to ensure that they do have an understood and appropriate and sustainable financial headroom to enable them to tackle the type of financial risks that will be coming their way over the next few years.
On lending again, a number of social landlords have said that not only when they're applying for new borrowing, but lending institutions are trying to change the terms and conditions to existing borrowing to increase those costs. In your experience, has that been widespread across the sector?
I think that there are always situations where a landlord is advised to negotiate, to engage with its lender. And it is, we always advise the landlords to make sure that they are properly informing and communicating what they intend to do, what their future actions are, to keep the lender on board. It's very important that these relationships are managed effectively. So we always, and there are various events which require landlords to engage with their lender. And we think in terms of trying to manage their costs, managing these relationships are absolutely critical so that the lender appreciates the situation, the issues and challenges that each landlord faces. We are aware that there are new forms of funding out there which might potentially be attractive. We don't know whether they are potentially attractive because to date we actually haven't had any firm proposals come across our desk in terms of new forms of funding. All funding has its risks, all funding has its costs, so we're just very keen that the boards of each landlord understand the situation they're in, understand what their borrowing costs are and might be in the future, but also that their relationships are managed to ensure that lenders are kept informed appropriately.
Thanks. And Gordon, you want to follow up on that?
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. In the last financial year, you carried out 22 performance inquiries. In general terms, what are the findings of these inquiries?
It's worth saying, first of all, that those inquiries would have been initiated by a concern that we had or the identification of a risk within the landlord. So it's not that we're engaging in routine cyclical inspection activity, which would give, if you like, a kind of broader view of performance. So a note of caution in terms of taking the outcomes of those kind of inquiries and extrapolating them across the sector as a whole. They've been in particular about specific issues, so not the broader performance. What will tend to happen is that we will tend to, when we engage with a landlord, get a good response in terms of them looking to give us the level of assurance we need that they recognise and understand the performance issue, that they have appropriate plans in place to address them. Nothing that's come out of that those inquiries have been so significant that we've had to look at a use of our statutory powers.
In terms of the nature of the performance inquiry, is it relating to the financial health of the organisation or the governance or, as you said earlier, quality of delivery? Or
those 22 that you referred to are specifically about service quality or performance issues. We have a range of other engagements with a number of landlords around financial health or governance issues, and they don't feature within that figure of 22.
Okay. And also in the last financial year, you managed 3 landlords out of near insolvency. What were the factors that brought about this situation, and what measures do you have in place to ensure that this doesn't happen to other RSLs in future?
I would say that in each of the three, we were alerted because of poor governance in terms of the particular landlord not particularly understanding the challenges it faced, not identifying and then mitigating risk, and not understanding some of the financial implications of the situation that they were in. So it stemmed, each of them stemmed from poor governance. We had very close and intensive engagement with each of those because it was very important in terms of tenant outcomes that we managed these situations, that we found rescue partners, which we helped facilitate. And I'm pleased to say that each of those has been rescued effectively. In terms of what we're doing about it to ensure this doesn't happen again, and it's absolutely critical, we have initiated a series of publications called Governance Matters, because it's very important that the whole sector understands the issues and the challenges that these particular cases got into. So we are taking a range of some of our more serious cases and publicising them in a more anonymous way, in terms of we're also introducing other issues that we encounter in the sector. We have launched these publications. We have also tried to engage directly with board members. We're very keen that we engage with board members in the sector. And we've run a series of events around the country called Governance Matters. And again, it's to facilitate board members getting together, engaging with each other, learning what went wrong, hopefully so that they can ask themselves, what would we have done in similar situations? Indeed, are we in similar situations? What are the right questions to ask? What kind of assurances should we be seeking? So we're obviously doing that. These events have been really popular, so much so that we're actually running them again this year, and we're continuing to publicise particular issues under Governance Matters. In terms of our own regulatory assessments, obviously whenever particular issues like this arise, we feed it into our own regulatory assessments, just to make sure that we're asking all the right questions, that we're aware of what might happen in similar situations elsewhere.
The fact that you've launched the publication and events around Governance Matters, would that suggest that there is a weakness within RSLs in terms of governance that has to be addressed then?
Yes, I think it would be fair to say there is, that in certain RSLs, as has been seen, there are weaknesses around governance. It's always a challenge in terms of having the right skills and expertise and level of challenge around a board table. We are very keen to ensure that that happens, and in fact in our advice to the sector, we're saying just make sure that you're continually asking yourselves, have you got the right skills around your table? How can you train, develop your members, both existing and new? How can you continue to attract the right kind of skills around that table, so that you have the right level of challenge and therefore the right level of assurance around the table? So yes, I would acknowledge that there are issues to be addressed. We're obviously working on those, highlighting them, and I think every board around the country, no matter what sector you were in, would say you always have to look at good governance and make sure that you have the right skills, experience and knowledge around your board table.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Convener. Can I go back to the issue of the financial risk posed to registered social landlords from welfare reform? The research that you published in October says that for the first 3 months of 2013-14, there has been an increase of around £789,000 in rent arrears across all RSLs for which you have complete data, and that 65% of RSLs have seen an increase in their percentage arrears levels. I just want to get a sense of how serious that issue is and how important it is that the Scottish Government does all that it can to mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax through the provision of discretionary housing payments.
We have, for some time now, recognised the potential risks that welfare reform brings for social landlords. And I think social landlords themselves were amongst the first to appreciate what some of the challenges would be, and have gone some way already to prepare their organisations and to support the tenants that may be affected. I think it's quite early on in terms of our first survey. It was the first quarter of this financial year that it looked at to draw too many direct conclusions, and we're certainly conscious that the impact has been mitigated both by the work that social landlords themselves have undertaken, but also by the availability of discretionary housing payments. We'll need to see how that progresses over the coming year or so. We'll be repeating our survey on a quarterly basis to ensure that we have as up-to-date as possible information on what that impact may be. We'll put that information into the public realm so that others can use that to help evaluate policy responses, including the mitigating impact of discretionary housing payments.
Can I ask you what specific measures you have taken or are considering which would encourage landlords to make their tenants aware of the availability of discretionary housing payments?
We have put out a range of advice to all landlords, and including within that, we incorporated a number of articles from landlords themselves who have been to the fore in providing appropriate and relevant advice to tenants. So I think that at this stage it's very much about information and encouragement, and I attended the Welfare Reform Committee meeting a couple of weeks ago, and at that meeting a number of local authorities were giving evidence that as yet they weren't entirely confident that all those who would be entitled to discretionary housing benefit payments had indeed applied for those payments. So I think there is still some work to be done to try and ensure that that assistance is maximised.
Thank you for that.
Could I just add to that? We are concerned about the impact of direct payment in terms of universal credit when that happens, because I think that will potentially have an even greater impact on the sector, and given competing priorities and given financial and economic situation, I think we will have to keep a close eye on rent arrears because of that particular event.
Just to be clear, the issue there is that the benefit is being paid directly
the housing benefit will be
the tenant
paid directly to the recipient, rather than at the moment what happens is that housing benefit is paid directly to the landlord, and because that income stream is regular and it's assured, lenders are look on that quite favourably because there is a regular and assured income stream. That is likely to change, and so it's possible that lenders may also look on that as a potential opportunity in terms of evaluating borrowing costs.
It's very helpful, thank you. Can I ask you about notifiable events, a serious event that could bring an RSL into disrepute or threaten its stability? Can you give committee some examples of the sort of event that would be considered notifiable, and also whether you expect these notifications to continue at the current levels for the year 2012-13?
Yes, notifiable events are a range of circumstances where we would expect landlords to advise us so that as a regulator we are aware of issues that might be developing within a landlord. They can be quite wide-ranging. In our guidance to landlords, we set out broad themes, but also give some examples, suggested examples, and they can be things relating to their governance, so that one or more governing body members resign for reasons that aren't personal in nature. It could be to do with their chief executive leaving, or a number of senior staff leaving. It can also be to do with potential reputational risks, so significant media coverage that might damage the reputation of the landlord. and therefore potentially impact on the reputation of the wider sector. It can be particular performance issues. So, for example, if the Health and Safety Executive was becoming engaged with a landlord around, for example, failures to appropriately manage gas safety in their stock. So there's quite a wide range of circumstances where we would expect landlords to keep us advised. And that's particularly so that we want to be a proportionate regulator. We don't want to place overly onerous demands on landlords for regular and comprehensive data and information. So we've set up an approach where we're alerted to relevant and pertinent issues.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to put on record, if I may, convener, I thought that the annual report was particularly user-friendly and presented the information in a very clear and understandable format.
Yes, I would agree with that. Just on notifications and what we were talking earlier about some RSL's performance and insolvency positions. I think there have been some amalgamations of RSLs. Do you think that's a trend that's likely to continue, and is it, in your view, a good or bad trend?
I have to say we don't have a view in terms of, as I said before, our objective and our duties are to look after individual RSLs. So in terms of whether further consolidation would be good or bad, I don't actually think we have a view on that. Having said that, I think we're aware that there have been more mergers in the sector. I think more individual landlords must look at their own situation and ask themselves questions about whether it would be more sensible to share some services, whether there are ways that they can deliver more cost-effective services in future. And I would think that for a number of them, amalgamating may be on the agenda. It's not an agenda that the Scottish housing regulator has. I think it's more for individual landlords and also for government as opposed to us as a regulator.
Thanks. Adam.
In your opening remarks, you invited questions on the National Panel of Tenants and Service Users, which I think has been operating for around a year now. Is that right? Could you just set out what benefits the establishment of this panel has brought?
Absolutely. We were very keen that we get to a more diverse range of people. I think we found that there are a number of excellent tenant organisations throughout the country, but we were keen to get to more minorities, we were keen to get to younger people, etc., and we were keen to offer tenants and others different alternatives and options on how they communicate with us, because not everybody wants to come to meetings, etc. So we were keen to get to a wider audience, not to replace anything that we do, but to complement what we actually do. We've set it up, hopefully, in the most cost-effective way in terms of a lot of it's done online, but we recognise that not everybody's online, so we engage with them by telephone and by post. We were hoping to get up to about 500 people. To date, we have over 300, and we've conducted our first survey to find out what the issues are, what are the top priorities. We've had a really interesting response to that. We found people are very keen to engage. We want to engage proactively as well, and we want to be able to use this panel in a way whereby we can just ask certain people, not always ask 350 people the same questions, but to divide it up a bit more. And we think that will really help us in making, it's very important that a regulator has good intelligence. It's very important that it's aware of the themes and the issues that are current. And because our objective, our statutory objective, is to look after the interests of tenants and others, gypsy travellers, etc., we're very keen that we're engaging regularly, but in a cost-effective way. As I say, to complement what else we do in terms of engaging with tenants, because, as you know, we always engage with RTOs, the tenant organisations, and we also have our own tenant assessors who provide a very valuable service to us in looking at specific areas of work for us. So we think we will, obviously, you see, what are the benefits? We're going to look and obviously evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing as we go on, but certainly the early signs are good.
Final question really is, no doubt you've answered some of it during the course of this evidence session, but there's key challenges and key issues for social landlords over the coming term. Would you like to list them in terms of the priorities you see?
I think in terms of our priorities are very much in terms of how we regulate, looking at governance, looking at financial health, and clearly with the Charter operating next year, it will be looking and getting much more information around service delivery. I think we see risks growing. We see challenges growing because of the economic situation in which we find ourselves. So in terms of priorities and issues that we're looking at, it will be around having effective financial management in social landlords, ensuring that tenants' interests are protected and safeguarded. I think one of the developments in the sector is to look at diversification. That may or may not be good, but we're very keen when subsidiary activities are engaged in, that the social landlords are aware of the risks and the benefits in which they are engaging, and also that tenants' assets are protected when they do set up subsidiary companies. So lots of issues for us as a regulator in maintaining and enhancing our levels of scrutiny to ensure that we can deliver an effective and appropriate regulatory remit.
Okay, any other member got any further questions? Okay, thank you very much for that. And of course, we will be able to discuss your findings on the housing options and homelessness when the committee does our follow-up work on the 2012 commitments sometime early, I think, next year.
Obviously, we said that we would send you in writing the report when we get it, which we will do early in the new year.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Can I suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to leave the room and to move into private as previously agreed by the committee?